The man known to history as Emperor Vespasian was born as Titus Flavius Vespasianus in the village of Falacrine to the northeast of the city of Rome in central Italy on the 17th of November in the year 9 AD. His father was Titus Flavius Sabinus, a member of the gens Flavia, an equestrian family which had been of relatively minor status for several centuries of Roman history, but which had become more powerful from the late 2nd century BC onwards, with a member thereof claiming the consulship, the highest political office in the Roman Republic, in 104 BC. However, the family later suffered demotion within Roman society in the transition from the Republic to the Empire, largely because Vespasian's grandfather had fought on the wrong side of the civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompeius Magnus between 49 BC and 46 BC, and faced sanctions along with many other Pompeians in its aftermath. As a result, Vespasian's father functioned primarily as a tax collector in the province of Asia, in what is now western Turkey, and later as a moneylender amongst the Helvetii north of Italy in modern-day Switzerland. Hardly a distinguished career for the father of a future Roman emperor. However, Vespasian's mother was Vespasia Polla. She came from a more prominent equestrian family. Her father, for instance, was a prefect of the camp, the third most senior rank within a Roman legion, while her brother eventually became a Roman senator. Both Vespasia's family and the gens Flavia were equestrian families, the second highest class within Roman society, being equivalent to the gentry or knightly class in later times, but below the patrician class, the Roman aristocracy. As such, while Vespasian hailed from what might be termed an upper-middle-class family, his background certainly did not indicate that he would rise to the top of Roman society. Vespasian was educated at Cosa, a town in southwestern Tuscany overlooking the Tyrrhenian Sea. His tutoring was overseen primarily by his paternal grandmother Tertulla, whose estate was in the Tuscan countryside. The schooling she provided him with would doubtlessly have focused on the core subjects of the Roman curriculum in ancient times, such as rhetoric, grammar, philosophy, as well as the classic texts of Roman literature, including Virgil's Aeneid, produced some years before Vespasian was born, and which presented a classic synthesis of Rome's foundation myth, one which traced the city's lineage back to Prince Aeneas of Troy. Vespasian evidently had fond memories of his childhood here, and in later years he would often visit Cosa, even long after his grandmother's passing. Little else is known about Vespasian's early life, although his education would have ended in the early 20s AD, as Roman children were deemed to enter adulthood around the age of 14, teenagehood being a relatively modern concept. Coming from a middling equestrian background, he entered the Roman military with a view to becoming an officer, an avenue which was seen as a springboard to a political career in Roman times. Vespasian grew up during a period of transition in Roman history. Rome had emerged as a significant power in the Western Mediterranean in the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, and then expanded to dominate the Eastern Mediterranean in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC. Consequently, by the mid-1st century BC, the city of Rome ruled huge amounts of territory, but it was not yet an empire in terms of its constitution and political arrangement. Rather, Rome was a republic throughout these centuries, one primarily ruled by the Senate and a number of magistrates such as the consuls, aediles, praetors, and quaestors, who were elected for set terms. However, the Republic's constant expansion made the generals of Rome's armies increasingly powerful, and in the 1st century BC, a series of civil wars occurred in the Republic as figures like Cornelius Sulla, Gaius Marius, Julius Caesar, and Pompeius Magnus sought to dominate the Roman state. Eventually, one of these figures, Octavian, emerged victorious, and in 27 BC he established a new constitutional position for himself. Renaming himself Caesar Augustus, he also adopted the title of Princeps, or First Citizen of Rome, though he is more usually known by one of his other titles, Imperator, meaning commander, from which the modern word emperor is derived. While these events had occurred decades before Vespasian was born, they are significant to his life story, for Vespasian's later ascent as Emperor of Rome himself was brought about owing to the fact that the ability of a Roman general to claim absolute power within the Roman state never disappeared, and the possibility that a Roman general might usurp the imperial title was made more plausible by the apparent problems with Caesar Augustus's successors. He died in August 14 AD, when Vespasian was just 4 years old. His immediate successor was his stepson Tiberius, who is generally viewed as a poor ruler who absented himself from Rome for many years and handed over far too much power to Sejanus, the prefect of the Praetorian Guard, the only military soldiers allowed in the Italian peninsula. Tiberius is even viewed as becoming tyrannical in the final years of his reign in the 30s AD, a problem which was compounded by his successor, Caligula, who became emperor in 37 AD, and is known, amongst other things, for his sadism, sexual deviancy, and planning to make his horse, Incitatus, a consul. While the historical accuracy of these depictions of Caesar Augustus's descendants, the Julio-Claudian dynasty as they are known by later Roman writers, is certainly open to question, the general view is that the failure of Augustus's heirs to live up to the standard of leadership he had shown weakened the dynasty's claim to power, and in doing so opened the window during Vespasian's lifetime to a fresh civil war and the ascent of a new dynasty. Vespasian and his sons would be the great beneficiaries of these developments. Vespasian's early career in the Roman military was one of gradual promotion through the ranks of the Roman war machine. He served in Thrace, in what is now Turkey and Bulgaria, as a tribune of the soldiers, a middling officer rank which placed him in charge of a few hundred men within a legion, each of which consisted of between 5,000 and 6,000 men, when all soldiers and auxiliary staff were taken into account. From there, he was promoted to the rank of questor in the province of Crete and Cyrenaica, the Roman name for Libya. As questor, he was in charge of the province's military garrisons, but Crete and Cyrenaica was a relatively poor province with a small garrison, most of which was stationed in desert forts in Cyrenaica to prevent Berber raiders attacking the Roman settlements along the Mediterranean coast. Though this was an inauspicious position, it qualified him to stand for election to become an aedile, and after several failed attempts, Vespasian obtained that office in 38 AD. This position placed him in charge of managing public buildings and events at Rome, and allowed him to cultivate greater contacts amongst the Roman patrician class and the central government in the late 30s AD. Therefore, he was able to gain election as a praetor in either 39 or 40 AD, the second senior-most magistracy in the Roman political world, junior only to the office of consul and the emperor himself. Vespasian was possibly serving as praetor when, in January 41 AD, the Praetorian Guard, with the connivance of many senators and court officials, murdered Caligula and placed his uncle Claudius on the throne. During these years of ascent, Vespasian also married and started a family. Sometime between 37 and 38 AD, when he was nearing his 30th year, he married Flavia Domitilla, the daughter of Flavius Liberalis, a questor's clerk from Ferentinum in Italy. She came from a very humble background, and the family may even have been descended from free slaves. As such, this was not a political marriage which Vespasian aimed to gain from socially and politically. They eventually had 3 children together. A son, Titus, was born in the last days of 39 AD. A daughter named Domitilla, for her mother, was born some years later, perhaps around 45 AD.
though the exact date and even year is unclear, while a second son followed after a good many more years in October 51 AD. Vespasian was also involved during these years in a contubernium relationship with Antonia Caenis, a freed slave woman. Such contubernium relationships in Roman times were generally between slaves or else a free citizen and a slave, in this case a rising Roman magistrate and a recently freed slave. Crucially, Antonia Caenis was a secretary and aide to Antonia Minor, the mother of the new emperor Claudius. This facilitated Vespasian's rise even further under the new emperor. Vespasian was involved in the 40s AD in one of the most significant episodes of the reigns of Augustus's successors. The founder of the Julio-Claudian dynasty had left instructions for Tiberius that future emperors should try to consolidate the vast Roman Empire after 2 centuries of rampant expansion rather than trying to conquer new territory. Tiberius had followed that advice to a large extent, but Caligula had been preparing an invasion of Britain when he was killed, and Claudius determined to follow through with it. This was perhaps because he was disabled, having a limp and being partially deaf. In an effort to prove his martial prowess in spite of his physical limitations, Claudius decided to continue with his nephew's proposed campaign and decided to invade Britain in the early 40s AD. Julius Caesar had visited Britain in the mid-50s BC, but had not undertaken a major military campaign there, while Augustus had planned several invasions, but none of these had come to fruition, and Britain remained outside of imperial control. Yet extensive trade was carried out with the people of these distant lands, and the Romans of the 1st century AD were well aware that there were extensive tin mines in the West Country, a valuable resource to the Romans if they could conquer southern England. Now at last, after a century of flirting with the idea by various Roman generals and rulers, Claudius launched an invasion of Britain in 43 AD. The exact scale of the Roman army involved is unknown, but it is most likely numbered between 35,000 and 40,000 men, made up of 4 Roman legions and another 15,000 to 20,000 auxiliary troops. Vespasian was central to this, while Aulus Plautius commanded the overall invasion, with Claudius stationed in northern Gaul, waiting to cross the English Channel when the invasion was sufficiently advanced. Vespasian, who only recently had served as a praetor, was appointed as a legate and placed in charge of one of the legions which was involved in the campaign, the Legio II Augusta. The armies crossed to southern England on hundreds of transport ships, though the exact landing site is unknown. Thereafter, they headed north to secure the site on the shores of the River Thames, where central London lies today, and where the Celtic Britons who inhabited Britain in ancient times had a settlement. There, Vespasian was involved in a major battle against the Celtic tribes of the region, such as the Atrebates, Trinovantes, and Cativellauni. Following the establishment of Roman control here, Plautius continued northeast to secure control of the foremost Celtic oppida, or hill fort town in southern England, Colchester. Vespasian was sent southwest to secure control of the tin and silver mines in Cornwall and Somerset. Along the way, he conquered over a dozen Celtic oppida and occupied the Isle of Wight before establishing his headquarters in what is now Exeter. Such was the speed of the initial conquest in 43 AD that Claudius was quickly able to proceed across the Channel later that year and received the submission of 11 British kings of southern Britain. The emperor then returned to Rome to celebrate his military triumph, while Vespasian and the other generals remained in England into the second half of the 40s AD, gradually consolidating the conquest and extending the borders into the English Midlands and southern Wales. Vespasian finally ascended to the most powerful political office in the Roman Empire in 51 AD when he was elected as consul. There were 2 consuls elected each year, and in the days of the Republic, prior to the creation of the imperial office by Caesar Augustus, the consuls had been the most powerful figures in Rome for the year that they held office. The office of consul was particularly prized because, after the consul served his term in office, he was usually appointed as governor of one of the Roman provinces. A governorship came with the ability to enrich oneself at the expense of the subjects there, though within reason. Some limited corruption was considered a prerequisite of office, but governors who were too avaricious could face prosecution back in Rome if they lined their pockets too extravagantly during their tenure of office. However, Vespasian did not enjoy this privilege of the consulship immediately following his year in office, for the simple reason that in the early 50s AD he fell out of favor with Claudius and in particular his wife Agrippina, who incidentally was also his niece and increasingly the power behind the throne in the latter years of Claudius's reign. When Claudius died in 54 AD, it was widely suspected that Agrippina had poisoned him. A son from an earlier marriage, Nero, became emperor. His reign would form the backdrop to Vespasian's own ascent as emperor. Vespasian had largely retired from public life following his consulship in 51 AD, owing to his falling out of favor with Claudius and Agrippina, and he remained out of public life for the remainder of the 50s AD. However, in 59 AD, Nero, who is depicted by the Roman historians of the early empire as growing tyrannical and unstable as his reign went on, is believed to have had his mother, Agrippina, killed owing to the influence of his soon-to-be wife, Poppaea. Vespasian's political rehabilitation ensued, and in 63 AD, he was finally granted the governorship of the province of Africa, approximating to modern-day Tunisia and parts of western Libya. His rule here seems to have been unpopular, and on one occasion, the denizens of the province pelted him with turnips. His biographer, Suetonius, who we will hear more about later, suggests that he failed to acquire the riches which he would have expected to while serving in Africa, and as a result, ended up selling mules when he returned to Italy, an occupation which earned him the title the muleteer, though Suetonius's account in this respect seems a little too colorful to be true. These years also saw changes in Vespasian's marital situation. His first wife, Domitilla, died at some stage in the second half of the 60s AD, following which his relationship with Antonia Caenis became more sustained. Despite Suetonius's claims that Vespasian had become a mule trader after returning from his time as governor of Africa in the autumn of 66 AD, Vespasian was selected to accompany Emperor Nero in a planned tour of Greece, an honor he would surely not have been granted had he not retained a certain status in Roman society. This was a dubious honor by 66 AD. If the Roman historians who wrote about his reign are to be believed, Nero had become increasingly unhinged by 66 AD. For instance, it was suggested that he had intentionally started the Great Fire of Rome, which burnt down a huge portion of the city in 64 AD, with the goal of clearing land to build himself a vast new palace. He had also become obsessed with Greek culture, games, and gladiatorial contests at the expense of governing effectively. The imperial tour of Greece commenced in the autumn of 66 AD, with the court largely residing at Corinth, the provincial capital. The most noteworthy event of the tour seems to have been Nero's participation in the Olympian Games, during which he unsurprisingly won every event. In the course of the tour, Vespasian appears to have offended the emperor by falling asleep during one of his musical performances and was briefly banished to outside of Corinth to atone for his sin. Vespasian's rise to power as Emperor of Rome would not have happened were it not for events that were occurring in the province of Roman Judea right around the time that Nero's tour of Greece commenced in 66 AD. Judea, which approximates with southern Israel and Palestine today, had variously been conquered by the Babylonians, Persians, and Macedonians between the 6th and 4th centuries BC. But in the 2nd century BC, a religious leader named Judas Maccabeus led the Jews in a revolt against the Seleucid Empire, one of the successor states to the empire of Alexander the Great. Maccabeus successfully re-established an independent Jewish state in the Holy Land, one which was ruled by his descendants for decades to come, and the history of which is the subject of Maccabees 1 and 2 in the Old Testament. However, this Jewish state, like all the other powers of the Eastern Mediterranean, soon faced Roman expansion in the region. Accordingly, in the mid-1st century, the Kingdom of Judea was effectively turned into a client kingdom of Rome's, which was ruled by King Herod I as a vassal of the Romans. The Herodian dynasty managed to retain some autonomy under Herod himself, but following his death around 4 BC, the Romans began consolidating their control of the region, and in 6 AD, the region was made into a new imperial province called Roman Judea, although Herod's descendants were allowed to remain as puppet rulers. Roman rule was always uneasy in Judea. The Jews were monotheists who worshipped what they believed to be the one true God, an unusual scenario in the Roman world, where the Romans themselves and many of their subjects, such as the Greeks, Egyptians, Celts, and Germanic tribes, were all polytheists, with pantheons of scores of gods who might have held different names in different regions, but which were all broadly similar to each other. For instance, the Greek king of the gods, Zeus, had a directly comparable god amongst the Romans called Jupiter. The unusual religious situation in Judea, as well as the fractious activity of dozens of messianic preachers across the province in the 1st century AD, ensured that Roman rule in Judea was already tense by the 60s AD, but they declined further following the appointment of Gessius Florus as the Roman governor of the province in 64 AD. Florus severely agitated the situation by allowing sacrifices to the Roman and Greek gods to be carried out at the temple in Jerusalem, the most sacred place for the Jews, as well as synagogues across the province. He also increased taxation throughout the province and stripped a massive amount of gold and silver from the temple authorities. This led many senior members of the Jewish community in Jerusalem to protest to Florus, but his response was heavy-handed in the extreme, having some flogged and others crucified. These events precipitated the beginnings of a Jewish revolt in the city of Caesarea in 66 AD, one which quickly spread across the province and resulted in the swift capture of Jerusalem after an insurrection there. Vespasian was not immediately involved in the suppression of the Jewish revolt. Instead, the legate of the province of Syria to the north of Judea, Cestius Gallus, was dispatched southwards to suppress it. However, his efforts failed, and so Nero, who was in Greece, recalled Vespasian from his exile outside Corinth for having offended the emperor and his musical abilities to lead the suppression of the Jewish revolt.
He was duly dispatched to Roman Syria with 2 Roman legions, the Legio X Fretensis and the Legio V Macedonica. He landed with these at Ptolemais, the ancient name for the city of Acre, in April 67 AD.
There he was joined by forces sent by King Herod Agrippa II, the Roman puppet king of Judea, who had fled the province when Jerusalem fell to the rebels. Agrippa contributed several thousand loyalist Jewish troops to Vespasian's forces. Thus, with 2 Roman legions and thousands of auxiliary troops, Vespasian invaded Judea from the north in the early summer of 67 AD. In tandem, his son Titus, who had been preparing at Alexandria in Egypt for some months, marched into the south of the province with the Legio XV Apollinaris. Between the 3 legions, the auxiliaries and their native allies, Vespasian and Titus commanded over 50,000 troops. The campaign quickly resulted in successes. Vespasian largely pacified the northern part of the province,
Galilee that summer following the successful sieges of Jodfat and Tarichaea, while other major towns such as Tiberias and Sepphoris surrendered without a fight in the face of the advancing Roman army.
The fall of Jodfat was particularly significant, as one of the leaders of the Jewish forces there was one Josephus, a member of one of the most prominent families of Jerusalem. This highly learned Jewish rebel subsequently ended up as part of Vespasian's entourage and experienced a complete ideological about-turn. From being a leader of the Jewish revolt in 66 and 67 AD, in the years that followed, Josephus became an ardent supporter of Roman rule in Judea. He subsequently became a free Roman citizen in later years and even adopted the name Flavius Josephus in deference to his patron. He also began working as Titus's translator, but he is most famous for his scholarly work when he went to live in Rome in 71 AD. A few years later, he completed The Jewish War, the most comprehensive account of the Jewish revolt, composed by a witness to it, and one of the most detailed accounts of any ancient war ever written. His other works, Jewish Antiquities and Against Apion, offered accounts of Jewish history, culture, religion, law, and philosophy, some of the most important texts written in Roman times. Josephus would not have produced these works had it not been for the patronage he was provided by Vespasian and Titus following his capture in 67 AD. Following the pacification of Galilee in 67 AD, Vespasian began preparing during the winter for a spring offensive further south towards Jerusalem, while also securing the Mediterranean coastline and linking up with Titus's forces from the south. This was a brutal campaign of suppression, and even Josephus, who was writing about his own brethren, didn't shy away from stating that as many as 100,000 Jews were either killed or enslaved in the pacification of Galilee and the coastal region. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, various factions had begun fighting amongst each other, leading some to leave the city and reinforce sites such as Masada, an ancient hilltop fortification in southern Judea. Vespasian and Titus recommenced their campaigning in the spring of 68 AD and, over the next year, captured many towns across the province in preparation for a major assault on Jerusalem. These included Jaffa, Hebron, and Ephraim. However, before Vespasian could begin besieging Jerusalem in 69 AD, events on the other side of the empire led him to change course. While Vespasian was overseeing the pacification of Galilee and preparing for his military drive toward Jerusalem in 67 and 68 AD, plans were afoot to bring Nero's reign to an end back in Rome. The emperor remained in Greece until the early winter of 67 AD, and it was the following January before he returned to Rome itself. Just weeks later, the governor of northern Gaul, Gaius Julius Vindex, revolted against Nero's rule. He was quickly defeated and subsequently killed himself, but his revolt set off a chain reaction whereby other powerful parties indicated their unwillingness to serve Nero any longer. The most significant of these was Servius Sulpicius Galba, a member of a powerful and wealthy senatorial family who was then the governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, a province which covered much of western Iberia. Galba had a significant military force under his command, and his background ensured that many parties began to support his cause once he rebelled. Nero's cause became desperate when the head of the Praetorian Guard, the elite troops stationed in the environs of Rome, Gaius Nymphidius Sabinus, also indicated his support for Galba, following which the Senate proclaimed the Spanish governor as the new emperor. Realizing that his grip on power had collapsed, Nero killed himself the following day. Had Galba managed to restore order and consolidate his rule following Nero's demise, Vespasian would doubtlessly have remained in the eastern Mediterranean, pacifying Judea. But events did not end in June 68 AD. within days, many others were scheming to replace the new ruler of Rome. One of these was Vitellius, a general whom Galba had just appointed to command the legions on the northern border in Germania.
Vitellius repaid him for his promotion by taking these legions and marching on Rome. But before he could get there, a former ally and close friend of Nero's, Marcus Otto, ascended as emperor in Rome after the Praetorian Guards murdered Galba in January 69 AD. He took the title Nero on the urging of the people of Rome, a development which casts into doubt the depiction of the original Nero as a maniacal tyrant. Why would Otho have tried to cast himself as a new Nero if the emperor from 54 AD to 68 AD had been so unpopular? Otto then gathered an army and headed north to confront Vitellius and his legions from Germania. At the Battle of Bedriacum near Cremona in northern Italy on the 14th of April 69 AD, Vitellius won an overwhelming victory. Otto killed himself 2 days later, and Vitellius proceeded to Rome as the third emperor to have reigned already in 69 AD.
But there would be one more in what has become known as the Year of the Four Emperors.
In the east, Vespasian and Titus were watching events far to the west with interest. Because they were in the process of suppressing the only major revolt underway against Roman rule at the time, Vespasian had the largest army anywhere in the empire under his control. As such, there was a great possibility that if he entered the civil war as a contender to become emperor, he could emerge victorious. He made the decision to do so in the early spring of 69 AD. Most likely once news of Galba's assassination reached Judea. Yet he did not move immediately. Instead, he began soliciting the support of the governors and generals of the provinces in the east.
Key here was Gaius Licinius Mucianus, the governor of Syria, the wealthiest and most powerful province in the region around Judea. With Mucianus's support assured, Vespasian was proclaimed as emperor by the legions under his command in early July. Thereafter, the governors of several provinces in the Balkans and in Egypt proclaimed their support for Vespasian, effectively making him ruler of the entire east of the empire and ensuring he had greater military forces and resources available to him than did Vitellius back in Rome. But Vitellius still controlled the Eternal City.
The civil war which followed between Vespasian and Vitellius was shorter than many at the time would have expected. Vespasian's own actions certainly indicate that he was preparing for a lengthy struggle. Instead of heading directly for Italy with his legions, many of which had been sent westwards already under Mucianus, Vespasian headed for Egypt. His goal in doing so was to ensure maximum control of this province on which Rome and Italy were dependent for much of their food supply, Egypt being the breadbasket of the empire, from which huge supplies of grain arrived every year to Rome. In the event of a lengthy conflict, Vespasian could cause huge damage to Vitellius's cause if the food supply was cut off, but this would not prove necessary. While Vespasian was consolidating his control over Egypt, Mucianus and another general who supported Vespasian, Marcus Antonius Primus, led his forces through the Balkans and towards northern Italy.
In the end, it was Antonius Primus who oversaw the campaign against Vitellius's forces in northern Italy and, after gaining several decisive victories, marched on Rome.
Vitellius attempted to abdicate at this point in favor of Vespasian, but his supporters refused to accept this, and the bitter siege of Rome commenced. Eventually, Antonius Primus secured the city for Vespasian, but not before many of the great temples and other buildings on the Capitoline Hill in the center of the city were destroyed. Vitellius was captured and duly executed on the 20th of December 69 AD. Vespasian was now the undisputed emperor of Rome.
Vespasian needed to move quickly to ensure that further unrest did not lead to the emergence of a new rival for power. He was aided by the fact that his younger son, Domitian, was in Rome and able to manage affairs there, while neither Antonius Primus nor Mucianus decided to use the forces under their command or their proximity to Rome to try and claim the imperial title themselves. When news reached Egypt of the defeat of Vitellius, Vespasian quickly ordered the dispatch of huge cargoes of grain to Italy to end the blockade of Rome he had imposed. Curiously, he stayed in Egypt for long enough to be formally hailed as emperor at a ceremony in the Hippodrome in Alexandria, the second largest city in the empire. Here he was proclaimed as pharaoh, the ancient title granted to the rulers of Egypt since the late 4th millennium BC. Once this was done, he left for Rome, where he arrived by the early summer of 70 AD. There he consolidated his control over the empire by increasing taxation on Rome and using the extra finances to make payments to the legions, which ensured their loyalty and blocked another rival from emerging. The first few years of Vespasian's rule are somewhat peculiar in that he effectively seems to have had a co-ruler during this time. The governor of Syria, Gaius Licinius Mucianus, had been Vespasian's foremost supporter during the civil war with Vitellius, and without his aid and, most importantly, the troops he supplied, it is possible that Vespasian would have been unable to defeat his western adversary and claim the position of emperor himself. Such was his role in Vespasian's ascent to power that he is believed to have stated sometime after the end of the civil war that he had, quote, bestowed the sovereignty upon Vespasian, that is, made him emperor. Perhaps unsurprisingly then, we find that Mucianus held an extremely powerful position in the first years of the new reign, one which has led some classical scholars to suggest he was effectively a co-ruler. For instance, while Vespasian was in Egypt after Vitellius's defeat, Mucianus was effectively governing the western provinces from Rome. Furthermore, he was appointed as consul, the most powerful political office in the empire, in 70 AD and again in 72 AD. He largely disappears from the record thereafter, and it is likely that he died in the mid-70s AD. While Vespasian had been engaged in the latter stages of the civil war, the Jewish revolt had still been smouldering in Judea, while the victories he and Titus had in Galilee and Samaria in 67 and 68 AD, as well as the infighting between various Jewish factions in Jerusalem, had ensured that there was no momentum for the leaders of the revolt to try to retake any towns or cities in 69 AD. While Vespasian was occupied elsewhere, they still held Jerusalem, along with extensive parts of the east and southeast of the province. Until these were secured, the revolt was not over. For that reason, Vespasian had left Titus in command of a reduced military contingent in Judea when he himself left for Egypt, and Mucianus proceeded northwest with the bulk of their legions. Titus subsequently continued to regain control of other parts of the province, and by late 69 AD, only Jerusalem and a number of other isolated strongholds such as Masada remained in Jewish hands. Then, 3 days before Passover in 70 AD, his armies arrived to Jerusalem and laid siege to the city. This would continue for nearly 5 months, with the city crammed with people who had fled there in the wake of the Roman advance. The siege became an enormously bloody affair, with many dying of starvation before the Roman capture of the city led to massive casualties. Josephus presented the wildly exaggerated claim that over 1 million people died in the siege. But while this can be safely discounted as the kind of embellishment that was typical of ancient historians, the death toll nevertheless must have numbered in the tens of thousands. Most strikingly, the great temple of Jerusalem, the center of the Jewish religious and cultural world, was destroyed in the final days of the siege. thus bringing the Second Temple period in Jewish history, which had commenced when the temple was rebuilt in the 6th century BC after the Babylonian captivity, to an end. The fall of Jerusalem did not bring a complete end to the Jewish revolt. There were still some isolated pockets of resistance to be dealt with. These included the hilltop fortress of Masada, where the Sicarii, a Jewish sect, had moved to and made their base of operations, after falling out with the authorities in Jerusalem in 68 AD, as well as Herodium in what is now the West Bank and Machaerus in modern-day Jordan. Titus, though, would not oversee the final stages of the revolt. Instead, he left the Legio X Fretensis in Judea to carry out these operations and left the east, along with Josephus, to join his father in Rome, because of the reduced forces left behind in Judea, and because of some inertia on the part of the Romans who realized that the isolated pockets of resistance in eastern Judea did not pose any sort of wider threat. It eventually took until 73 AD to complete the full suppression of the revolt, when Masada was captured after a long siege, in the closing stages of which the Sicarii killed each other rather than face capture and enslavement by the Romans. Tens of thousands of Jews were enslaved following the fall of Jerusalem and other engagements during the suppression of the First Jewish Revolt. The destruction of Jerusalem is the most controversial episode of Vespasian's reign, but just as significant were the punitive policies which were imposed on the Jewish people by Vespasian and his sons in the years that followed. Firstly, Vespasian and Titus lauded their victory, despite how bloody it had been, holding a triumph in Rome to celebrate it. More damagingly, the Jews were prohibited from rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem, and the city was occupied by a Roman legion going forward, with army veterans also established in colonies there in a direct assault on Jewish heritage and their religion. As a result of this, many Jews began leaving Judea for Egypt and other provinces in one of the first major early episodes in the long story of the Jewish diaspora. To compound matters, a punitive tax was imposed on all Jews, whether in Judea or the other provinces, whereby they had to pay 2 drachmas every year simply for being Jewish. In all of these was sown the seeds of 2 further major Jewish revolts in the 2nd century AD, one between 1115 and 1117 AD, which engulfed much of the eastern Mediterranean, particularly Egypt, Cyrenaica, and Cyprus, where there were large Jewish communities, and another, known as the Third Jewish Revolt, which occurred between 135 and 137 AD. Scholars have suggested that the roots of modern anti-Semitism can be traced to the anti-Jewish views and legislation which first appeared during Vespasian's reign following the First Jewish Revolt. Judea was not the only region of the empire that was in revolt when Vespasian became emperor. To the north, near the mouth of the river Rhine, in what is now the Netherlands, the Batavii, a Germanic tribe who dominated this area in pre-Roman times, had risen in revolt in the summer of 69 AD, taking advantage of both the civil war and the fact that Vitellius had pulled many of the Roman legions out of Rome's northern provinces in Gaul and Germania and brought them south to enforce his claim to become emperor. A local Batavian leader, Gaius Julius Civilis, whose name clearly indicates that he had risen in Roman service and Romanized, led this revolt, inspired by the actions of the German warlord Arminius, who in 9 AD had led a revolt in eastern Germany which destroyed 3 Roman legions and pushed the Romans back west over the Rhine. But the Batavian revolt was nowhere near as successful, as the civil war ended before it could gather momentum and the Batavii failed to acquire allies amongst other tribes. Thus, while Civilis did manage to defeat and nearly destroy 2 Roman legions in battle in 69 AD, Vespasian quickly sent an army of 8 legions north, under his son-in-law Quintus Petilius Cerealis. With this massive force, which outnumbered the entire Batavian population, Civilis crushed the revolt, and a legion was stationed permanently at Noviomagus thereafter, the site of the modern-day city of Nijmegen. There are a number of difficulties in evaluating Vespasian's rule. There are multiple detailed histories written by Roman historians who lived during his reign. The primary ones are the histories of Tacitus, a Roman senator of the late 1st century AD, and Suetonius, the author of the Lives of the Caesars, who grew up in the 70s AD and later became an imperial archivist and secretary in the early 2nd century AD. Tacitus's histories covers the period from the Civil War of 68 to 69 AD, down to the end of the Flavian Dynasty, which Vespasian founded in 96 AD. Suetonius's Lives presents biographies of all the Caesars, from Julius Caesar and Octavian down to the end of the Flavian Dynasty as well. In both instances, they were eager to present Vespasian as a model emperor who had restored order to the empire after the civil war and years of alleged tyranny under Tiberius, Caligula, and Nero. Yet they were clearly biased. Tacitus belonged to an old Roman noble family that had fallen on hard times under the Julio-Claudian emperors, but which was restored to prominence during Vespasian's reign. Moreover, his father-in-law had been appointed as governor of Britain by Vespasian, and he had clear reasons for presenting the first Flavian emperor in as positive a light as possible. Similarly, Suetonius's methodology was to present the Julio-Claudian emperors who followed Augustus as tyrants, and to present the idea of a non-hereditary imperial office in the best light possible. Given that his employers in the early 2nd century AD, the emperors Trajan and Hadrian, had both been selected by their predecessors to succeed them, not on the basis of family ties, but purely their merit as individuals. These biases aside, Tacitus and Suetonius, along with Josephus, are still the most important sources we have for Vespasian's time as emperor. Suetonius is a particularly useful source for his reflections on the personality and character of the emperors whose lives he studied. Vespasian, as he depicts him, was a ruler who never forgot his humble roots, remaining amiable and down-to-earth throughout his reign and avoiding the excessive behavior which had apparently characterized the reigns of Tiberius, Caligula, and Nero, each of whom had grown up as part of the imperial family. He was charitable, and this extended in particular to providing financial aid to old impoverished Roman families from the patrician and equestrian classes. This latter trait may have been why he was so favorably depicted by Tacitus, Suetonius, and others, who were members of or had connections to the senatorial and political classes in Rome. Moreover, unlike his predecessors, Vespasian is understood not to have developed the predilection for having people killed for upsetting him over rather trivial matters. One area, though, where he was repressive was in his intolerance towards philosophers, especially those who questioned the wisdom of imperial rule and the hierarchical structure of society. In line with this, he revived certain laws which punished talk of restoring the Republic. The impression overall is of a stable, conservative ruler. While many aspects of Vespasian's reign are obscure or quickly passed over by the main accounts of Tacitus, Suetonius, or the later Greco-Roman historian Cassius Dio, it is clear that he did engage in concerted efforts to promote his reign through propaganda of various kinds. As we will see, much of this focused on his building program, but other measures were also taken. For instance, Vespasian manipulated the Roman coinage to present himself as the unchallenged new emperor. More coins, on average, for the length of his reign were issued bearing Vespasian's profile than were for emperors such as Tiberius, Claudius, and Nero, while there was also a concerted effort to remove the coins which had been issued by Otto and Vitellius with their profiles from circulation, given that for many Roman subjects in the wayward provinces of the empire, coins were the most direct engagement they would ever have with a distant emperor. This was a significant move. This practice was followed by his sons in the subsequent reigns. Vespasian also publicized certain divine omens which were presented as evidence of divine favor towards him becoming emperor. The Romans took such divine omens very seriously, and the success of Vespasian's efforts to promote them is clear from the fact that details of them are related not just by contemporaries such as Suetonius, but also by Cassius Dio, who was writing more than a century after Vespasian's reign. Vespasian was also a major patron of education and the arts. In contrast to his persecution of philosophers, he gave financial and other bequests to eminent poets and artists who lived in Rome and beyond, while set salaries were established for many teachers of Latin, Greek, and other subjects such as rhetoric. His motives in doing so were most likely to foster the growth of a professional bureaucracy, which would begin to administer the Roman provinces and the central government in Rome itself in a more efficient manner, with tens of thousands of officials needed empire-wide to run the provincial administrations, collect taxes, uphold Roman law, and manage the military from an administrative perspective. A number of the ancient world's most substantial scholars also worked during Vespasian's reign, and the emperor patronized them. Quintilian, a brilliant Spanish rhetorician, whose abilities in ancient times were deemed to be second only to those of Cicero, established a school of rhetoric in Rome in the late 60s AD, which flourished during Vespasian's rule. The emperor was clearly a supporter of Quintilian, who was made consul in the 70s AD. Tacitus possibly spent time here, as well as Pliny the Elder, who in the 70s AD was compiling his famous Natural History, one of the foremost encyclopedias of knowledge compiled in Roman times. Pliny was also made a procurator by the emperor as early as 70 AD. A major aspect of Vespasian's reign was the manner in which he expanded Roman rule in Britain, where 30 years earlier he had been central to the first establishment of Roman rule in the south of the island. This had been expanded northwards into the Midlands and southern Wales in the intervening period, but Vespasian desired to go further. In 77 AD, he appointed Gnaeus Julius Agricola as governor of Britain and charged him with expanding into northern Wales and even further northwards in Britain itself. There is an unusually large amount of information on this campaign because Tacitus composed an historical biography of Agricola, who was his father-in-law. In 78 AD, the new governor initiated a new campaign against the Ordovices, the tribe which dominated the bulk of northern Wales and the island of Anglesey. The Ordovices had been campaigned against in previous years, but had remained only partially subdued. By the end of the year, Agricola had largely completed the conquest of Wales, bringing forces into their island stronghold of Anglesey and forcing the tribe to accept peace terms. He subsequently headed northeast, campaigning with his legions into the Scottish lowlands. Hence, although he would not live to see it, Vespasian's directives to Agricola set in motion events which saw the Roman Empire extended into northern England and southern Scotland for the first time. Back in Rome, the emperor was becoming known for an altogether more peculiar policy. In ancient times, and indeed until as recently as the 16th and 17th centuries in some parts of Europe, urine was used for numerous industrial processes, including dyeing clothes, tanning, wool production, and as detergent to wash clothes, as the ammonia in it removes stains. Consequently, as disgusting as it might seem to the modern mind, urine from the public bathrooms across the city of Rome was collected and sold to various people involved in clothes washing and manufacturing. Nero appears to have been the first to introduce a tax on urine, which those who used it for these purposes had to pay. but according to both Suetonius and Cassius Dio, it was more systematically imposed by Vespasian. Alternatively, the urine tax might be misunderstood, and it may have been a simple tax on using the public bathrooms which were built across the city. In any event, Vespasian became so famous for introducing this urine tax that when the municipal governments of cities like Paris and Rome first began introducing public bathrooms in their cities in the 19th century, they were called Vespasienne and Vespasiano. Urine taxes aside, Vespasian's greatest contribution to the civic life of the city of Rome was the building program that he oversaw. A vast proportion of the city had been destroyed during the Great Fire of 64 AD, and it still had not been redeveloped by the time Vespasian came to the throne, if the sources are to be believed, because Nero had planned on taking over a vast part of the city centre and building his new palace across it. His downfall and the civil war further stalled any plans to rebuild the city, and so it fell to Vespasian to oversee this work in the 70s AD. Suetonius credits him with the restoration of the city by allowing anyone who had been left homeless in 64 AD and who had subsequently left the city to return and build on any vacant lots in a move which seems utopian when contrasted with modern bureaucratic inertia when attempting to build anything. Vespasian also began the redevelopment of the Capitoline Hill, one of the 7 hills on which Rome was built. Here he erected a temple of peace alongside the Forum. More significantly, he rebuilt the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, which had suffered damage in both the Great Fire and during the Civil War, and was reputedly the oldest major temple in the city, built hundreds of years earlier. This is where the triumphal parades of Roman generals and emperors ended, and was an iconic site in the city's history. Over on the Celian Hill, he also erected a temple in honor of Claudius, during whose rule Vespasian's public profile had become significant enough to allow him to later claim the office of emperor. As significant as these other building projects were, Vespasian is primarily remembered today from an architectural standpoint for building the Flavian Amphitheatre, or as it is more commonly known today, the Colosseum. There had been gladiatorial games and other spectacles held in Rome for centuries by the time of Vespasian's rule, but these had no fixed home, with different amphitheatres, often built of wood, being used over the decades. Vespasian decided to rectify this and turned over land which Nero had earmarked for his vast palace for the purposes of building such a stadium. Building work on the amphitheatre, which initially could hold an audience of over 50,000 people, was commenced around 72 AD, using money which had been acquired by plundering Judea as the Jewish revolt was suppressed. Built with slave labor and out of travertine limestone, volcanic rock and Roman concrete, the resulting edifice was laid out in 3 tiers, which would be filled according to one's social class. While at nearly 50 meters high, it was probably the tallest building in the Roman world when finished. However, Vespasian would never live to see it completed. In the end, it was not until 80 AD, the year after his death, that the Flavian Amphitheatre was finished. It would subsequently be expanded to hold upwards of 80,000 people in future decades. The great amphitheatre was nearing completion by the time that Vespasian died. His reign in the end lasted nearly exactly 10 years from when he was first proclaimed by his legions in Egypt back in 69 AD. His demise came in the countryside to the northeast of the city of Rome, near where he was born almost 70 years earlier. There is some dispute over whether this occurred on the 23rd or the 24th of June 79 AD. His death was described as follows by Suetonius, whose account is worth quoting at length. During his 9th consulship, he suffered a slight illness when in Campania, and having at once returned to the city, he set off for Cutili and the countryside of Reata, where he used to spend every summer. There, despite the fact that his illness was exacerbated by an intestinal disorder
caused by excessive use of cold baths, he continued to perform his usual imperial duties just as before, even hearing embassies as he lay in bed. Suddenly stricken with an attack of diarrhea, so severe that he almost fainted, he said that an emperor should die on his feet. As he was struggling to rise, he died in the arms of those helping him on the 9th day before the calends of July, at the age of 69 years, 1 month, and 7 days. Vespasian was quickly deified, a Roman tradition whereby deceased emperors were deemed to have become gods in death. Following his death, Vespasian was succeeded by his eldest son, Titus. Owing to his role in ending the Jewish revolt in Judea after his father had headed west to wage war on Vitellius, and the fact that he had held many prominent offices himself in Rome during the 70s AD, Titus was well known to the Roman people when he ascended. He was apparently a popular ruler, one who benefited in terms of the public perception of him from presiding over the inaugural games, which were held to commemorate the completion of the Flavian amphitheatre shortly after he became emperor. Consequently, Suetonius and others presented positive assessments of his reign, but it was all too brief. He died of a fever in September 81 AD, when just 41 years of age. As he did not have any sons or a designated heir, he was succeeded by his brother Domitian. This younger Flavian reigned for 15 years and is generally understood today to have been an efficient but autocratic ruler, one who clashed with the Senate and the Roman aristocracy. He was assassinated in 96 AD by a group of court officials, an act which brought the Flavian dynasty, which Vespasian had founded, to an end. In his place, the Senate chose Nerva as the new emperor, an elderly and respected Roman magistrate and senator. Henceforth, for the next century, the empire was ruled by a succession of rulers known today as the 5 good emperors, each of whom chose their successor on the basis of their merits as a potential ruler, rather than familial or hereditary considerations. Vespasian's reign as emperor is in some ways difficult to assess. His rise was extremely fortuitous and came about only because he was in command of a large Roman army in the eastern Mediterranean in 68 AD, one which was tasked with suppressing the Jewish revolt when the Civil War broke out back west. He was consequently able to use these military forces to wage war on Vitellius and become emperor himself. In the process, he brought stability to the empire and established a new dynasty which would rule it for nearly 3 decades. His accomplishments thereafter were substantial. He suppressed the Batavian revolt, expanded the Roman presence in Britain, and undertook a major building program, which included one of the most famed buildings in Roman history, the Colosseum. Yet there are black marks against his name. The suppression of the Jewish revolt was brutal, although admittedly much of it was carried out by Titus, while the roots of anti-Semitism are in many ways traceable to policies he enacted against the Jewish people following the revolt. But beyond these issues, it is difficult to assess Vespasian. Overall, he seems to have provided a period of general peace and prosperity after the alleged tyranny of Nero's reign. But whether Vespasian's qualities as an emperor and the contrasting chaos of Nero's reign were inventions of Tacitus and Suetonius in their histories and biographies may never be fully known. What do you think of Vespasian? Was he one of Rome's greatest emperors, who successfully restored order after the chaos of the Civil War, or was he a power-hungry demagogue who was later presented in the best light possible by Tacitus and Suetonius? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. The man known to history as Titus Flavius Vespasianus was born in late December 39 AD in the area of the Campus Martius in Rome. His father was Vespasian, the eighth successor to Caesar Augustus as emperor of the Roman Empire and the founder of the Flavian Dynasty, one of Rome's more successful yet relatively short-lived ruling dynasties. He came from an undistinguished equestrian family, equestrian referring to the class of Roman society that ranked below senatorial in the Roman social hierarchy. Vespasian was born around 9 AD and entered a Roman world that was relatively settled and stable, having undergone a century of bloody upheaval during the fall of the Republic, ending in the establishment of the Principate under Caesar Augustus and the transition of Roman government from a republican city-state into an autocratic administrative government, responsible for the governance of a vast empire. Titus's mother was Domitilla the Elder, who came from a relatively humble family, the daughter of a quaestor's clerk from Ferentium. She married Titus's father, Vespasian, in around 37 AD, though she would die before her husband's ascendancy to the imperial throne. The cause and exact date of her death are not known. The erosion of the Republic arguably saw its first violent manifestation in the deaths of the Gracchi brothers by their senatorial opponents in 133 and 121 BC. The elder brother Tiberius became tribune of the plebs, an office representing the lower classes of Rome, and used his considerable constitutional powers in an attempt to force through radical economic and land-owning reforms, which faced opposition from the patrician Senate. His apparent radicalism and accumulation of power led to the death of Tiberius and his followers at the hands of a violent mob organized by the Senate, and 12 years later, a similar fate would befall Tiberius's brother Gracchus, when he attempted to rejuvenate the ambitious and reforming legacy of his brother. These blatant displays of political violence and willingness to step beyond traditional political boundaries heralded a century of chaos in Rome, with the incredible expansion of the city's empire and the riches, glory, and prestige this brought to individual commanders was a major factor in destabilizing a political system that was designed to organize the affairs of a city-state, rather than an overseas empire of incredible scope and wealth. Victorious generals led armies that were loyal to themselves rather than to the state, and thus statesmen like Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla started using violence and the riches they had accumulated on campaign to purge political enemies and violate hallowed customs. In the 80s BC, Sulla broke with centuries of tradition to march his army on Rome and declare himself dictator. Another issue the Republic faced was the lack of a major enemy power that could unite Romans in opposition. After the destruction of Carthage in 146 BC and the defeat of Mithridates of Pontus in the mid-1st century BC, Rome did not face an existential threat, anything like that of Carthage in the Punic Wars. This lack of a powerful foe meant that Romans were increasingly turning on one another. This came to a head when a new generation of statesmen and warlords emerged, led by Pompey the Great and Julius Caesar. The wealth, popularity, and power concentrated on these men turned Rome into an effective oligarchy in the 50s BC, with the emergence of the first triumvirate featuring Pompey and Caesar, alongside Marcus Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome. It was perhaps inevitable that such ambitious men would turn on one another and that the Senate would fight to reassert its influence. The spark came with Caesar's campaign in Gaul, modern-day France, where his stunning and brutal successes garnered him unparalleled fame and admiration in Rome, and saw him possess an immensely powerful army that was deeply loyal to their leader. The Senate,
now viewing Caesar as a mortal threat to the Republic, ordered him to relinquish control of his army. Caesar, knowing that such an action would almost certainly lead to his arrest, made the fateful decision to cross the Rubicon River in 49 BC with his army into Italy, thus beginning a great civil war with Pompey and the Senate. The decisive battle was fought a year and a half later at Pharsalus in Greece, where Caesar's legions won a decisive victory, forcing Pompey to flee to Egypt, where he was murdered. In 48 BC, Julius Caesar was the master of Rome and of much of the civilized world. However, this state of affairs was to prove short-lived. Though he was made dictator by the Senate after his victory over Pompey, his move to make himself dictator for life in 44 BC, coupled with his steady accumulation of power, was too much for many in the Senate who were accustomed to a political system in which power was competed for by Rome's patrician families, rather than held and bestowed by one man. These tensions came to a head on the Ides of March in 44 BC, when a conspiracy led by the senators Brutus and Cassius, but involving dozens of senatorial co-conspirators, murdered Caesar at a meeting of the Senate, days before he was due to depart Rome to lead a campaign against the Parthian Empire. Rome was again plunged into civil conflict, which would last on and off for over a decade, until finally Caesar's adopted son and heir Octavian stood alone at the summit of the Roman world, with total control over the army and state, and was given the name Augustus, meaning revered one, by the Senate. During his 40-year overlordship, Rome would transform from a city-state republic to an imperial government, increasingly aware of and attentive to its provinces outside of Rome itself. Though the decades of Augustus's dominance over the Roman world solidified one-man rule at the top of the political system, the demise of the Republic opened up many opportunities for equestrian families like Vespasian's that were not available under the strict oligarchy of the Republic, especially families from provincial Italy and the regions outside of Rome. Under the emperors, a vast bureaucracy for governing all the provinces of the empire developed, and it became open to aspiring families from throughout the empire in a way that prominent political positions had not been open when a few patrician families dominated the Republic. Thus, although Vespasian's father was a humble money lender and tax collector, his ambitious sons were determined to climb the cursus honorum, the Roman ladder of political hierarchy. Indeed, it was Vespasian's elder brother Sabinus who appeared destined for greatness from an early age, with Vespasian largely following in the latter's footsteps. Nevertheless, after military service in Thrace, Vespasian was made a quaestor in 35 AD, entering into Roman magisterial service. As he climbed the Roman political ladder, Vespasian was able to gain favor with the short-tempered, unpredictable Emperor Gaius, better known by his nickname Caligula, who held power between 37 and 41 AD. Exploiting the vanity of the young emperor, Vespasian used his public office to glorify the emperor's victories and harshly punish those who conspired against him. Substantial advancement for the Flavians came, however, under the rule of Caligula's successor, Claudius. In the early 40s AD, Vespasian received command of Legio II Augusta, then based in the province of Germania. However, in 43 AD, this legion was ordered to become part of the invasion of the island of Britain. Roman influence had been strong over Britain ever since Caesar's first expedition there in the 50s BC. However, Claudius now aimed for complete conquest of the island and its annexation into the empire. Under the overall command of Aulus Plautius, Vespasian led his force along the southern part of the island from east to west, ending in Exeter. Later Flavian writers lightly exaggerated Vespasian's exploits, claiming that he won 30 pitched battles. It is more likely that Vespasian enhanced his reputation through a good performance as a competent military commander, and he was rewarded by Emperor Claudius for his performance in the invasion. After this, both Vespasian and his brother became consul, the highest political office on the cursus honorum, Vespasian gaining the honor in 51 AD. As was traditional, Vespasian was able to administer a foreign province following his consulship, and in 63 AD he became proconsul of Africa, where he demonstrated his rigorous administrative and financial skills. At this time, Vespasian's eldest son, Titus, was around 24 years old. What little we know of Titus's early life is provided by the Roman historian Suetonius, who tells of Titus being raised at the imperial court and becoming very close with Claudius's son Britannicus. It was due to his father's outstanding performance in the invasion of Britain that Titus was able to be educated at the court of the emperor. Britannicus was later assassinated by the Emperor Nero, and it is said, albeit this is difficult to confirm, that a young Titus was sitting alongside his friend when he drank the poison that would kill him. Certainly, Britannicus's death would have a large impact on the young Titus, and he would later work to cultivate his memory. Suetonius states that in around 57 AD, Titus served as a military tribune in Germany and Britain. Military tribunes were officers in the Roman army who ranked below the legate and above the centurion, and was a traditional preparatory role for a career in the upper echelons of Roman senatorial politics. Following this stint in the army, where he gained praise and acclaim, Titus entered the legal profession and married his first wife in around 63 AD, Aracina Tertulla, the daughter of a former prefect of the Praetorian Guard, the elite unit of the Roman army that served as personal bodyguards of the emperor. The couple had a daughter named Julia. However, in the very same year of approximately 65 AD, Aracina died, and Titus then married again, this time to Marcia Furnila. Furnila was from a prestigious senatorial family, and she soon gave birth to another daughter. However, subsequent events would demonstrate the extent to which marriages in elite Roman society were dominated by political and social concerns. Furnila's uncle, Marcius Sornaus, was a former consul who fell foul of the Emperor Nero in 66 AD due to accusations made against him for plotting against the emperor during his stint as proconsul in the province of Asia. His condemnation on false charges immediately blackened any association with his close relatives, and thus Titus divorced his wife that same year to retain his standing amongst Nero and his associates. Up until the year 66 AD, Titus followed a conventional trajectory into the upper echelons of Roman politics. At this time he had gained a quaestorship and thus stood at the lower rungs of the senatorial class. However, things would soon change for Titus and his father as they would embark upon one of the most infamous campaigns of the first century. In 66 AD, Vespasian was invited by the Emperor Nero to accompany him on his tour of Greece as an official travel companion. However, during this trip, Vespasian offended the emperor, leaving a theater or possibly falling asleep whilst Nero was in the middle of one of his long solo singing performances. This led to Vespasian being banned from all companionship with the emperor. Later that year, however, Vespasian was appointed to the command that would dramatically alter the fortunes of the Flavians when he was sent to Judea in order to quell the Jewish revolt that had broken out there. It is not totally clear why he was appointed, but his relatively obscure background and the family name may have convinced the increasingly paranoid Nero that Vespasian did not pose a threat to his authority and would thus be suitable to command a large force. Nero's paranoia at this time derived from the uncovering in 65 AD of the Pisonian conspiracy, a plot to murder Nero and replace him with the aristocratic orator Calpurnius Piso. A great number of senators, equestrians, and military personnel were involved, and the emperor was in many ways lucky to survive. Nero's rule was dramatically altered following the conspiracy's uncovering, and Vespasian's appointment was thus likely made out of considerations for the emperor's own safety, with Nero assuming that Vespasian did not pose a threat to his power. By 66 AD, the situation in Judea was very serious for Rome. Judea had been a province of the Roman Empire since 6 AD, though there had been Roman dominance over the area since the 60s BC, with the conquests of Pompey. Though the Jews were not persecuted for their faith as a recognized religious minority, they suffered under the heavy taxes imposed by the empire and by the appointment by the Romans of the Jewish high priest. This is because the high priest was chosen from the section of the Jewish population that collaborated with Rome, and thus was alienated from the rest of the Jewish population. Tensions were inflamed by the influence of Hellenistic culture and the resulting emergence of a Romanized Hellenistic elite who dominated the affairs of Judea and promoted the cult of the emperor. Rebellious groups emerged among the Jewish population, known as zealots, who believed that any means were necessary to attain complete political and religious liberty and autonomy. Perhaps unsurprisingly, groups like this rose in popularity during the reign of Caligula, where the unstable emperor ordered his statue to be set up in every temple throughout the empire and threatened to destroy the Jewish temple when the Jews refused. Things came to a head under the procuratorship of Gessius Florus, as Florus had particular disdain for the Jews and lacked the political skill to quell the gathering tensions. In 66 AD, a revolt broke out in the town of Caesarea in Judea, as a gang of zealots attacked the Greeks living in the town after a Greek mob had profaned the local synagogue. Florus chose this moment to initiate a forceful gathering of taxation in Jerusalem, and as part of this, he plundered vast quantities of silver from the sacred Jewish temple. This infuriated the Jewish population. However, unrest was brutally quashed by Florus, who executed several city leaders. This only turned the unrest militant, however, and armed rebels destroyed the local Roman garrison and embarked on the destruction of Roman people and symbols throughout Judea. Rebel mobs also fought with Jews who were opposed to rebellion until the zealot factions won out and determined to cleanse Judea of Roman influence. Rome soon responded with the proconsul of Syria, Cestius Gallus, marching south with around 30,000 troops to put down the revolt. Gallus attempted to capture Jerusalem, but was repulsed after a siege and forced to retreat. His troops were then ambushed by Jewish rebels at Beth Horon and took heavy losses, including the humiliating loss of an eagle standard. Gallus died soon afterwards, possibly killing himself. This stunning victory galvanized the Jewish rebels and pushed aside moderates, hardening their desire for complete Judean independence from Rome. With Judea spiraling out of control and Romans determined to take vengeance for Gallus's defeat, Vespasian was appointed to put down the rebellion in late 66 or early 67 AD, and he set off immediately with Legio V and Legio X. Vespasian made Titus, now 27 years old, legate of his third legion, Legio XV Apollinaris, then stationed in Egypt, whilst Vespasian made his way to Judea by land from Greece, going through modern-day Turkey. Titus travelled across the Mediterranean and took command of his legion in Egypt before moving north. The Romans had around 60,000 soldiers in total, and Vespasian and Titus began the campaign in Galilee, in the north of Judea, and one of the most radicalized regions in the area. The campaign was brutal, with entire villages and towns being destroyed by the Romans. Titus himself was able to lead the final onslaught against numerous towns in the north, although at Giscala, the last remaining rebellious town in Galilee, Titus fell for a ruse on the part of the rebel leader, which allowed a large group of the most dedicated rebels to escape to Jerusalem. Though unquestionably brave as a commander, Titus had not yet developed the careful and considered military approach that was definitive of his father. It is estimated that in 67 AD, as many as 100,000 were killed or enslaved in the pacification of Galilee. Meanwhile, Galilean refugees had fled to Jerusalem, and the Jewish resistance was now concentrated in this great city. As the Romans entered winter quarters, early 68 AD saw a Judean civil war erupt in Jerusalem between rival Jewish factions, with the radicals attacking moderate leaders and eventually solidifying their hold over Jerusalem. Vespasian and Titus were content to sit back and allow their enemies to destroy themselves. As the campaign season of 69 AD opened, Vespasian led his forces towards Jerusalem, capturing towns that anchored the city's supply route and tightening the noose around the city, destroying any rebellious towns as he went. Throughout 68 AD, Titus was in the province of Syria, seeking to sort issues of jurisdiction between Vespasian and the new governor of the Roman province, which lay to the north of Judea. Titus's deft political skills ensured that he won over the governor Licinius Mucianus, who would come to be an important ally to Vespasian in the year that lay ahead. The importance of the coming year was soon evident as news reached Judea that Nero was dead, with Servius Sulpicius Galba declared as emperor by the Senate. Discontent with Nero had not dissipated following the Pisonian conspiracy. Indeed, it had only increased as the emperor became ever more tyrannical and cruel in the following years. Rebellions grew, especially in Gaul and in Hispania, under the governorship of Galba, and this increasing pressure led to the head of the Praetorian Guard abandoning Nero and declaring for Galba, and the rest of the emperor's guards then followed suit. Fleeing the city, Nero learned that he had been declared a public enemy by the Senate, and on the 9th of June he either took his own life or ordered his personal assistant to kill him. Tacitus wrote that Nero's death was celebrated by the Roman upper classes, but was somewhat lamented by the lower classes, who had often gained from the emperor's excesses. Nero was the final member of the Julio-Claudian dynasty who had monopolized imperial power since the time of Augustus. His death was dangerous for the empire, as the primacy of the Julio-Claudian bloodline had always limited the number of candidates who could claim the imperial purple. Now, however, that the dynasty had died with Nero, ultimate power could be competed for by a greater number of candidates, all of whom could command great armies. In Judea, Vespasian was unnerved by reports that Galba, who had been declared as emperor by the Senate, was executing opponents and Nero loyalists, and thus sent Titus to pay formal respects to the new emperor and to win his favor. Titus had reached Corinth in Greece in January 69 AD, when he heard news of Galba's murder on the 15th of that month. Galba was a straight-laced disciplinarian, and his failure to sufficiently reward legions, who had rebelled against Nero and the Praetorian Guard, soon made him unpopular. Suffering from gout, the aging emperor was killed by the Praetorians. The Guard had been won over by Marcus Salvius Otho. Otto had joined the rebellion against Nero under Galba and had hoped to be named his successor. When Galba chose somebody else to adopt, Otto organized a conspiracy amongst the Praetorian Guard and rose to power. Thus, 69 AD was the so-called Year of the Four Emperors, and it would see the Flavian dynasty establish itself as the successors to the Julio-Claudians as rulers of the Roman world, and would enable Titus to rise from the upper echelons of Roman politics to master of the greatest empire of the age. Otto was the second emperor to take power in this year, and he was immediately challenged, as prior to Galba's death, the legions of Germany had rallied behind the provincial governor Aulus Vitellius as their candidate for emperor, and were marching on Italy even as Otto established himself as emperor in Rome. Considering his and his father's situation in Greece, Titus feared becoming a hostage in the hands of one of the rival emperors, and so decided to turn back to the east. The Roman historian Tacitus presents Titus as contemplating at this point the potential for a Flavian attempt to take power, and it is possible that this played into Titus's decision not to pay homage to any of the rival emperors in the west, and instead help his father consolidate his power in the east. The difficulty of this decision is emphasized by the fact that he returned to Judea via Cyprus, where he consulted with the oracle of the Paphian Venus, who apparently favored Titus's decision, and he thus sped to the eastern shore of the Mediterranean. Vespasian remained a novus homo, or new man, in amongst the Roman political class, and was far from being one of the wealthiest or most prestigious men in Rome. Indeed, Vespasian himself was not a particularly ambitious man by Roman standards, and as emperor was well known for his indifference to the glory of the imperial office. Thus, his decision to make an attempt for the imperial purple was not an easy one to make. At first, Vespasian was happy to sit back as Vitellius and Otto fought one another in northern Italy. Gradually, however, Vespasian's supporters and advisors pushed him towards making the fateful decision to intervene, especially after the controversial Vitellius defeated Otto at the Battle of Bedriacum and was proclaimed emperor. Mucianus was particularly insistent, and as the momentum for a Flavian intervention grew amongst the Romans in the east, the legions in Alexandria proclaimed an oath of loyalty to Vespasian and declared him Caesar, followed by the legions in Judea and then Mucianus's Syrian legions. Though the proclamation of the legions was made to seem spontaneous, in reality the Flavian camp had planned their opening moves carefully and had decided to commit in the middle of June. Titus's role in his father's decision to march on Rome and his ultimate elevation to the imperial power was extremely significant. Unlike his father, Titus had been brought up around the imperial court and possessed great ambition and the political skills and talents necessary to help make his ambition a reality. His winning of Mucianus as an ally of Vespasian in the previous year was pivotal, as the Syrian governor commanded as many legions as Vespasian, and their forces combined were considerable. Some historians consider Titus to have been the originator of the Flavian bid for the empire, following the death of Galba. As the heir apparent to Vespasian, he had among the most to gain from his father's elevation. At a final organizational conference, it was decided that after ensuring the security of Judea and the eastern borders of the empire, Mucianus would lead a force west, whilst Vespasian would travel to Egypt to secure Rome's vital grain supply. Titus, meanwhile, was given supreme command over Judea and Syria and charged with completing the pacification of the region, which at this point in the campaign meant the capture of Jerusalem. Vespasian appointed his close ally Tiberius Alexander as Titus's chief of staff, perhaps a reflection of his son's lack of military experience in such an important role. Whilst Vespasian was in Egypt, the Flavian campaign met with unexpectedly rapid success. The eastern half of the Roman world had declared for Vespasian, and armies loyal to him rapidly entered the northeast of Italy and won a decisive victory over Vitellius's forces at Cremona. Vespasian's forces then entered Rome in heavy street fighting and dragged Vitellius through the streets before killing him in December of 69 AD. Having been declared emperor by the Senate whilst in Egypt, in 70 AD, Vespasian departed for Rome to take up his new position. Titus had accompanied his father to Egypt, but in the spring of 70 AD he departed to Judea in order to open the final campaign in the region. His army contained a corps of 4 Roman legions, Legio 15 Apollinaris, Legio 5 Macedonica, Legio 10 Fretensis, and Legio 12 Fulminata, and was supplemented by auxiliary and native forces. Titus's army likely totaled around 70,000 troops, a force even larger than that commanded by his father at the opening of the Judean campaign. Titus made straight for Jerusalem, ensuring the security of Roman supply lines as he went, and began siege preparations in April, around the time of Passover. The Jews in Jerusalem were by this time utterly determined to face down the Romans, and were composed of broadly 3 factions, one led by John of Giscala, a prominent zealot leader, and one of the Galilean rebels who had fled the town of Giscala to Jerusalem after deceiving Titus in 67 AD. Another important leader was Simon bar Giora, who had led the Jewish forces that ambushed Gallus's forces at Beth Horon at the beginning of the uprising in 66 AD. And Eleazar ben Simon led a 3rd rebel force. The Jewish forces in Jerusalem could muster perhaps upwards of 20,000 troops, but more importantly, they were ensconced in a city with formidable defenses. In the factional violence before the approach of the Romans, however, much of the city's food supply had been destroyed by fire, leaving the defenders vulnerable to starvation. The city was divided into 3 sections: the upper and lower cities in the south, the new city in the north, and the Temple Mount in the east. The city had 3 defensive walls and contained numerous fortresses at its corners. To add to the confusion within the city and to strain its food supplies, Titus allowed the passage of pilgrims into the holy city for Passover, yet did not allow them to exit. As Titus ordered his legions to surround the city and establish camps to the west and on the Mount of Olives to the east, the Jewish forces sent out expeditions to harass the Roman forces, one of which almost captured Titus himself when he was carrying out personal reconnaissance. Titus ordered the construction of ramps and battering rams to breach the city walls. The construction of these was initially disrupted by Jewish sorties out from the city. However, the Romans began a concentration of artillery, including stone-throwing catapults, on the defenders, which pinned them to their defenses. Using siege towers, artillery, and bronze-head battering rams, Titus's forces were able to destroy the city's outer walls in only a few weeks. Concentrating on the north of the city, the Romans focused their forces on the first wall and the Antonia fortress. As his forces erected siege works and battered the inner walls of the city, Titus dispatched Josephus, a Romano-Jewish military leader and writer who had defected to the Romans 3 years earlier and, now a Roman citizen, was a friend and advisor to Titus, to persuade the Jews to surrender. It is from an account written by Josephus that we have much of our information on the first Jewish revolt. Josephus, however, was derided by the defenders, and Titus's offer was rejected. After the destruction of the outer defenses, Roman forces were neared to the heart of the city, besieging Temple Mount and the Antonia fortress. There was savage street fighting as legionaries were ambushed by rebel fighters. The Jews even managed to tunnel beneath the Roman position and undermine the ground beneath, collapsing and destroying many of the Romans' siege works. Amidst the costly fighting, Titus reconsidered his strategy and decided to intensify the blockade of the city by constructing a siege wall encircling the city to prevent anybody escaping and any supplies from reaching Jerusalem's defenders. This wall was completed in only 3 days and was 4.5 miles long, testament to the remarkable engineering abilities of the Roman army. It worsened the famine within the city considerably, leading to misery and atrocities amongst the inhabitants of the city. 3 weeks after completing the construction of the wall, Titus's men used ramps against the walls of the Antonia fortress and finally took the stronghold after fierce fighting, and they razed it to the ground. The fall of the Antonia left Temple Mount as the last remaining stronghold in the city, and Jewish forces had concentrated here in expectation of a final battle. Titus ordered a ramp to be constructed by the walls of the Temple Mount, and though the Romans initially suffered setbacks when the rebels organized the collapse of a 50-feet-high colonnade into flames, killing many Roman troops in the process, Titus felt that the end was drawing near and pressed the attacks. The Jewish destruction of the western colonnade and the Roman destruction of the northern colonnade forced the rebels to fall back to within the walls of the temple complex itself. Eventually, amidst the fighting, the walls of the temple were set ablaze, though it was not clear exactly how this happened. Josephus, in his account of the siege, is keen to exonerate Titus for the destruction of the temple and the chaos that ensued. He claims that Titus would never have ordered the annihilation of a holy place. Rather, his goal had been to seize it. However, a much later Roman historian, possibly basing his account from a lost section of the mostly reliable Histories of Tacitus, states that Titus wished for the temple to be destroyed in the siege so as to exterminate the Jewish and Christian religions. It is unclear which source to trust, as Josephus was keen to ingratiate himself with the Flavian dynasty, and his patron was Titus himself. However, the latter source was written long after the event and likely altered the account of Tacitus. Either way, having finally broken the resistance of the defenders, the Roman army unleashed terror and chaos onto Jerusalem, slaughtering most of the able-bodied men and rounding up the inhabitants to be sent to Rome as slaves. The temple and the city were plundered of their wealth, including the sacred menorah, the 7-branched candle from the temple, whilst other sacred valuables from the temple were turned over to Titus by captured priests. To celebrate their victory, Titus ordered sacrifices to be made in the temple court to the Roman gods, even as the temple itself still burned. The Roman troops hailed their commander as Imperator, a title usually reserved for the emperor in gratitude at the hard-fought success. The destruction of the temple took place in August of 70 AD, although the siege did not come to a complete end for another month, as defenders fled to the upper city. However, after besieging the walls of the upper city, the Romans met with little resistance from the starved and exhausted rebels, and that part of Jerusalem was overrun and met with the same destruction as had the rest of the city. After the rounding up and enslavement of the survivors on Titus's orders, the Flavian commander instructed the city and the temple to be completely razed, with the exception of a number of towers within the temple complex to stand as testament to the strength of Jerusalem's defenses. Josephus stated that over 1 million people died in the Jewish revolt, although historians do not view this figure as credible, as it was unlikely that 1 million people lived in the entire province of Judea at the time. Nevertheless, thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, perished or were enslaved in the revolt and its suppression, and it must be said that Titus himself bears great responsibility for the brutality of the siege of Jerusalem. This is not to say that his actions were atypical of a Roman general subduing a revolt, and indeed, The Romans faced few revolts in the history of their empire that were as significant and tenacious as the Jewish revolt, but it nevertheless underlines the brutality of the age and the brutality of Roman rule, that Jerusalem and Judea were decimated the way they were for their insubordination. In his command of the siege, Titus displayed the tenacity, the skill, and the brutality that was expected of Roman commanders and lauded by Romans of his day. And whilst the events of the siege are deeply unpleasant to modern audiences and have left a deep scar on the history of the Jewish people that has echoed through the ages and persists to this day, to most Roman citizens, Titus's reconquest of Jerusalem made him a hero and elevated him to almost godlike status in the Eternal City. Before departing Jerusalem, Titus stationed the 10th Legion within the outskirts of the city. Vespasian wanted to make Judea an independent province and have legions stationed at its heart rather than in distant Syria, so as to ensure the events of 66 to 70 AD could never be repeated. Many sources depict Titus as growing arrogant and self-indulgent in the years following the fall of Jerusalem, and making his father nervous as a result. However, many of the anecdotes that play to this narrative, such as his wearing of a diadem in Egypt, seems highly unlikely and were probably generated in order to emphasize his apparent transformation upon becoming emperor in 70 AD into a benevolent and loved ruler. That he would undergo such a dramatic change of personality upon rising to the imperial purple seems unlikely, though it is not impossible that his triumph at Jerusalem impacted his ego significantly. Titus held celebratory games in Syrian cities before meeting with envoys of the king of the Parthian Empire of Persia on a diplomatic mission. Roman military movements close to the Parthian border had generated suspicion, and thus the Flavian utilized his diplomatic talents to quell the nerves of the Parthians, and was presented with a golden crown by the envoys in honor of his victory over the Jews. After his diplomatic business was complete, Titus returned to Rome by way of Alexandria in early 71 AD, and was awarded a triumph by Emperor Vespasian. Since the days of the Republic, commanders who won great victories for Rome could be awarded a triumphal procession steeped in civic and religious significance to parade the spoils of war and experience the acclaim of hundreds of thousands of Romans. This joint triumph was celebrated by Titus, his father, and his younger brother Domitian, and its description by Josephus provides our most detailed account of a Roman triumph. The rebel leaders Simon Bar Giora and John of Giscala were paraded along with hundreds of the most handsome prisoners, whilst the looted treasures were displayed for all to see, with items taken from the temple itself displayed most prominently, including the menorah and the golden showbread table and a copy of the Torah. The procession, with Vespasian and his son the center of attention as they rode in magnificent apparel, ended at the temple of Jupiter, where Simon Bar Giora was taken to be executed, and the triumphant general went to offer a sacrifice in thanks to the chief deity of the Romans for their victory. To the Romans, the events of 70 AD demonstrated the triumph of their pantheon of deities over the God of Israel. The procession has been immortalized on the Arch of Titus, which still stands in Rome to this day. It was constructed in 81 AD by the Emperor Domitian, Titus's brother and successor. The arch contains panels depicting the triumphal procession and the fall of Jerusalem, with the images closely paralleling the description of events given to us by Josephus. Particularly clear on the arch's engravings is the 7-branched menorah, which is depicted being looted from the temple and paraded on the streets of Rome. The arch has been important in art history and was the inspiration for the Arc de Triomphe in Paris.
Soon after the triumph, Titus's exalted political position was confirmed when he was formally granted tribunician power, which had, since the years of Augustus's rule, been the mark of an emperor or his heir designate, and Titus, along with his brother, had already been given the title of Caesar by the Senate before his return to Rome. Though it may seem fairly obvious to modern eyes that Titus would be Vespasian's successor, in the empire at this time, primogeniture was far from the established custom, and indeed, Titus would be the first son to succeed his biological father as emperor in the empire's history. Titus himself did not possess a male heir. Though he had been married twice, he did not show any enthusiasm for marrying again. Instead, he preferred the company of young men with whom he was thought to have had romantic relations. This was very ordinary in ancient Rome, even if excessive indulgence in sexual relations with younger men was perceived to be a sign of moral decadence. In today's terminology, Titus would likely be best described as bisexual. However, there is no such term in the classical Latin, and his romantic interests would not be seen as noteworthy or peculiar by the Romans of his day. Nor was there pressure on Titus to produce children, as his younger brother Domitian was being lined up as Titus's potential successor, so that the Flavian dynasty seemed secure. From 71 AD until the death of Vespasian, Titus was a close partner to his father and played a key role in the ruling of the empire. Though he was never co-emperor, and the hierarchy between Vespasian and those beneath him was always clear and adhered to. Vespasian held the titles of Augustus, Pontifex Maximus, head of the Roman state religion, and did not share them during his lifetime. Titus, however, held numerous important roles during the remainder of his father's reign, which underlined his position as the heir designate and ensured that challenges to power from outside the Flavian dynasty did not arise. Between 71 and 79 AD, he held the consulship 7 times alongside his father. This was by now a mostly ceremonial office, but it nevertheless is a testament to his influence at the highest levels of the Roman state. In addition, he was made protector of the imperial office and became Praetorian prefect in 73 AD, holding command of the Praetorian Guard, and thus responsible for the emperor's security and for security in Rome more generally. Titus also became Vespasian's chief administrative officer, in charge of penning edicts and dictating official letters, and he often represented his father to the Senate. Matters of strategic and civic importance remained the preserve of Vespasian, including masterminding the construction of the great Flavian amphitheatre known today as the Colosseum. Titus, however, seems to have been far from popular in Rome, as he often took his role as protector of the imperial office to brutal extremes. This, combined with a reputation for debauchery, led to him being seen as a second Nero. These tensions were fueled by his controversial relationship with Berenike, an Eastern client queen. Berenike was a member of the Herodian dynasty as the granddaughter of Herod the Great, and along with her brother King Herod Agrippa, she ruled a client kingdom of varying extent on the eastern border of the Roman Empire, where it is rumored the two engaged in an incestuous relationship. During the First Jewish Revolt, it was rumored that Titus and Berenike, who had supported Vespasian's bid for the imperial throne, engaged in a romantic affair. Indeed, Tacitus, writing around 40 years later, states that Titus abandoned his mission to Rome in 69 AD, not due to the civil war and the death of Galba, but because he was ablaze with passion for Queen Berenike. However, the exact nature of their relationship during this period is not truly known. In 75 AD, Berenike arrived in Rome, and it seems that her friendship with Titus was rekindled as she accompanied the imperial heir wherever he went, and she lived in his part of the imperial palace. Whatever the truth about the relationship between Titus and Berenike, the already unpopular Titus did not help his cause amongst the Roman people by being seen together with a controversial and influential Eastern queen, as the reputations of Cleopatra and later Zenobia of the 3rd century Palmyrene Empire would attest. Powerful Eastern queens could become figures of hatred and resentment in Rome, especially when they were perceived as having a malign influence over Roman leaders. Indeed, rumors of Berenike's incest and Titus's overwhelming infatuation with her during the Jewish campaign may well have been slanderous gossip in the vein of that which swirled around Cleopatra in the 30s BC. This reached a head when prominent philosophers of the Cynic school openly denounced Titus and Berenike in the public theatre. Though Titus responded to this denunciation brutally by executing one of the philosophers, he understood that his reputation was becoming tarnished in Rome, and sometime after 75 AD, he dismissed Berenike from his company. Nevertheless, by 79 AD, the year of Vespasian's death, Suetonius relates that the people of Rome feared the accession of Titus and of the reign of a second Nero, who would bring cruelty, tyranny, and excess back to Rome. His father was widely admired, having reigned with administrative prudence, competence, and being personally honest, moral, and decent. After the chaos of Nero and the year of the 4 emperors, Vespasian had restored order and prosperity to the empire, and through his calm and steady leadership, Romans were once more enjoying the peace and stability of the Pax Romana. The fear of what was to come after the death of Vespasian is evidenced by a plot uncovered in 79 AD, led by 2 of Vespasian's allies and supporters, Caecina Alienus and Appius Marcellus. Though the details are very unclear, it seems the 2 men were plotting to overthrow the Flavian regime. Getting word of this, Titus acted quickly and Caecina was murdered, with Appius Marcellus put on trial and found guilty by the Senate before taking his own life. Though this threat was quickly dealt with, it illustrates the tension that surrounded Titus's accession and the fear that Rome's stability over the previous decade would not continue. Vespasian died in mid to late June of 79 AD, having ruled for a decade, and was immediately succeeded by Titus in one of the smoother instances of imperial succession in Roman history. Titus quickly set about proving to the people of Rome that they had nothing to fear regarding his accession. Soon after coming to power, Titus began to curtail the treason laws, or the lex maiestasis, which were severe laws that intended to root out any form of treason or plotting against the emperor. Having been greatly expanded in scope under Tiberius, these laws gave rise to frequent trials that prosecuted suspected enemies of the emperor, as well as a professional class of informers, known by the Latin delatores, who often fed emperors false information about powerful and wealthy Romans in an attempt to gain wealth and influence themselves. Titus despised these delatores, and his elimination of treason trials allowed Romans to speak more openly with less fear. Remarkably, not a single senator was executed during Titus's short reign. Similarly to Shakespeare's Henry V, Titus is portrayed in Roman sources as undergoing a momentous personal change upon his accession to the imperial throne. He is shown as suddenly grasping the gravity of his position and becoming a beloved character almost overnight. Whether Titus evolved more gradually, or whether his unpopularity as heir has been exaggerated, it is clear that in his short time as emperor, Titus made a deeply positive impression on the Roman people, becoming widely admired as his father had been and being affectionately remembered in the sources both for his stewardship of the empire and his personal traits. Indeed, it is also possible that Titus made no such personal change, and that he was a shrewd enough political operator to recognize his deep unpopularity in Rome
upon his father's death, and thus the need for him to present himself as a transformed leader. Titus faced problems early on in his rule, however, as just months after his father's death, Mount Vesuvius, just east of present-day Naples in southern central Italy, erupted in one of the most legendary and destructive natural disasters in human history. Pompeii and nearby Herculaneum were utterly annihilated by a wave of pyroclastic lava flow and buried beneath immense piles of ash. The disaster killed thousands and left behind a city frozen in time. Archaeological excavations in Pompeii have shed more light on daily life in the Roman Empire than anywhere else, as people and buildings were encased under layers of pyroclastic flow, and thus, when excavating, archaeologists have discovered the remains of the city and its people exactly as they were in 79 AD. Eyewitness accounts of the disaster survive, written by Pliny the Younger, a prominent writer and statesman. Some years after the event, Pliny wrote a letter to his friend Tacitus, himself a prominent historian, detailing the eruption of Vesuvius and also describing the death of his uncle, Pliny the Elder, an author, naturalist, and statesman. The elder Pliny was then a commander in the Roman fleet stationed in the Gulf of Naples, and he attempted to organize a rescue mission to save his friend Rectina, though as he sailed towards Herculaneum, he died, possibly from the inhalation of fumes or of a heart attack. When he received news of the disaster, Titus appointed 2 ex-consuls to organize the relief effort, as well as donating substantial sums from the imperial treasury to aid the victims of the disaster. According to Cassius Dio, the emperor also visited Pompeii twice after the eruption, although no attempt was made to rebuild the city, presumably because the destruction was too complete, and building on the layers of debris and volcanic matter too difficult a task. Titus's rule would see yet more disaster strike the heart of the empire when, in 80 AD, a great fire broke out in Rome, a conflagration on the level of the Great Fire of 64 AD under the Emperor Nero. Starting from the Capitoline Hill in the center of the city, it spread to the northwest and raged for 3 days and nights, destroying large numbers of buildings and homes. In the wake of the fire, likely being caused by the unsanitary conditions in its aftermath, a great plague swept the city, heaping yet more suffering on the Roman people. As with the eruption of Vesuvius, Titus's response was widely admired. He offered consolation for the victims publicly through his edicts and sent practical help by donating great sums of his personal wealth to aid the victims and help with restoration. The sources say that he refused financial assistance from other individuals and foreign powers, instead taking the expense of the disasters onto himself. Much of the rebuilding work would take place under Domitian, though Titus personally oversaw the building of a new temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, Rome's supreme deity. Titus won the hearts of the Roman people in other ways, however, and his reign was not one remembered simply for the natural disasters that befell the empire. In 80 AD, Titus took over the construction of the top level of the Flavian amphitheatre, better known as the Colosseum. This iconic amphitheatre, the largest in the Roman world, was begun under Vespasian and remains one of the great, perhaps the greatest wonders of the Roman world that can still be seen to this day. It was located in a low valley in central Rome, surrounded by the Celian, Esquiline, and Palatine hills. Titus officially opened the Colosseum in spring of the year 80 AD and organized 100 days of games featuring spectacular gladiatorial shows in the new arena, which was, in the wake of the previous disasters, immensely popular with the Roman people. The shows put on during the 100 days of games included gladiatorial combats, chariot races around the vast arena, and a battle to the death between war elephants. At one point during the games, the stage level of the amphitheatre was flooded,
and a mock naval battle was staged between two groups of condemned criminals. These displays delighted the crowds, although the brutality of them would no doubt disturb modern audiences, as most of the criminals who took part in the naval battle, for instance, were killed. Another project completed by Titus that proved popular with the people of Rome was the new complex of public baths, which were opened in 80 AD. They were built on the southern slopes of the Oppio Hill, northeast of the Colosseum. Indeed, an access staircase was built that led from the Colosseum straight to the thermal rooms. The remains of these baths can still be seen today, though they were later dwarfed by the 3rd century baths of Caracalla and the early 4th century baths of Diocletian. Both the Colosseum and the baths of Titus represented an attempt by the Flavian dynasty to augment a rupture with the perceived tyranny of Nero and usher in a new age of public beneficence on the part of the emperor. The land on which both of these projects were built was land that had been used by Nero to build his lavish Domus Aurea, or Golden House, a private palace of immense luxury that had been built in the aftermath of the Great Fire of 64 AD. With these projects, the Flavians were in effect returning land that had been used by the emperor to showcase his decadence and wealth to the Roman public to use for their own enjoyment. This was a symbolic gesture that was designed to showcase Titus and his father's commitment to the public good, in sharp contrast to their Julio-Claudian predecessor. During his reign, Titus also sought to revive the imperial cult in Roman worship and solidify the Flavian dynasty at the pinnacle of the Roman world. He thus helped to ensure that his father was officially deified around 6 months after his death, and attempted to promote the honoring of Vespasian to cement his and his brother's claim to the imperial throne. To this end, the foundations were laid for what would become the Temple of Titus and Vespasian in Titus's reign, and this work was completed in the reign of Domitian. A persistent challenge for Titus throughout his brief reign came in the form of his brother Domitian. Titus continued the practice of his father of consigning Domitian to relative political inactivity. Yet, despite this, the sources suggest that the younger Flavian was eager to gain glory like his elder brother had in the Judean campaign, and that he was impatient with his relative lack of influence throughout the 70s and into the 80s AD. Upon becoming emperor, Titus had made Domitian his official partner and successor, and appointed him as his co-consul in 80 AD. However, Titus did not bestow upon him any of the traditional powers and trappings of the imperial heir presumptive, such as the granting of tribunician powers that Vespasian had given to Titus, nor did he give to him a major role in the imperial government, and this no doubt further stoked Domitian's grievance. In regards to the external foreign policy of Titus as emperor, we have very little information from the ancient sources. Indeed, from the ending of the 100 Days of Games to mark the opening of the Flavian amphitheatre in July of 80 AD, until Titus's death in September the following year, the record tells us virtually nothing of the actions of Titus or of wider events within his empire. We do, however, have a short account of his death from Suetonius. He states that in September of 81 AD, Titus was travelling to the ancestral Flavian home in the territory of the Sabine Hills to the north of Rome, when he was struck by a sudden fever, potentially malaria, on his journey and died quickly. According to Suetonius, Titus's last words were allegedly, "I have made but one mistake." Whether or not the emperor spoke these words before he died is deeply disputable. Nevertheless, historians, to the extent that this story can be believed, have questioned whether Titus might have been referring to his brother. The sudden nature of Titus's death and the relative obscurity surrounding it have led some to suspect that his brother Domitian may have had some involvement in the death of his brother, knowing full well that he was the heir to the imperial throne. Certainly, Cassius Dio and other later Roman historians, many of whom loathed Domitian, wrote of plots concocted by Titus's younger brother to poison him and then seize the throne. Titus's last words, therefore, from this perspective, could have referred to his mistake in not eliminating his brother before it was too late. This, however, is pure speculation, and it must be emphasized that Domitian, who would rule for 15 years after the death of Titus, was utterly despised by many of the Roman authors upon whom we rely for our knowledge of imperial history, due to his tyrannical rule in his final years as emperor and, perhaps more importantly, for his shrinking of senatorial power, prestige and influence, and concentration of government in the court of the emperor. Most of the Roman historians were of senatorial class and came from a group that had notoriously bad relations with Domitian, and thus rumors of his involvement in Titus's death, though they cannot be completely discounted, should be viewed with a heavy amount of scrutiny. In any case, Titus was succeeded by Domitian in an orderly fashion, the latter proceeding to the camp of the Praetorian Guards upon hearing of Titus's death, and giving a donative to the soldiers, who then proclaimed him emperor. Shortly afterwards, the Senate met to decree honors for the deceased Titus and awarded Domitian imperium, the title of Augustus and the office of Pontifex Maximus, thus ratifying his accession to power. Titus was deified later in Domitian's reign, as his father had been. Assessing Titus the emperor is difficult due to the shortness of his reign, just 2 years and 2 months, and the relatively little information we have about it. His reign tends to blend into that of Vespasian's because it was Titus who completed many of the building works begun by Vespasian, such as the Colosseum, but also because his reign marks a continuation of Flavian's stability, competence and good governance. Certainly, the circumstances in Titus's brief reign were anything but stable, with eruptions, fire and plague. However, his response to these disasters demonstrated compassion and sense, and the problems that faced Rome in his reign were not the fault of the emperor and his governance, which is not something that can be said for many other periods in Rome's post-Augustan history. The nature of the ancient Roman sources are such that emperors are often lavished with praise or smeared and maligned, and Titus definitely fell into the former category, being described by Suetonius as the darling and delight of the human race, with the majority of Latin writers following Suetonius, describing him in similar terms, including his patron and historian of the first Jewish revolt, Josephus. They emphasize his generous response to the disasters that afflicted Rome and his dedication to the public good displayed in this, as well as his building projects and public games. Above all, they stress that he was a kind and moral character, no doubt deliberately contrasting Titus with the tyrannical character of his brother who succeeded him. Cassius Dio, however, has a perhaps more rounded perspective on Titus that seems to accord with his record. In Book 66 of his Roman history, he states that his satisfactory record may also have been due to the fact that he survived his accession but a very short time, short, that is, for a ruler, for he was thus given no opportunity for wrongdoing, for he lived after this only 2 years, 2 months and 20 days, in addition to the 39 years, 5 months and 25 days he had already lived at that time. In this respect, indeed, he is regarded as having equaled the long reign of Augustus, since it is maintained that Augustus would never have been loved had he lived a shorter time, nor Titus had he lived longer. For Augustus, though at the outset he showed himself rather harsh because of the wars and the factional strife, was later able, in the course of time, to achieve a brilliant reputation for his kindly deeds. Titus, on the other hand,
ruled with mildness and died at the height of his glory, whereas if he had lived a long time, it might have been shown that he owes his present fame more to good fortune than to merit. Though this judgment may seem harsh, it does reflect the fact that Titus will always be something of a mystery in Roman imperial history, an emperor who ruled one of the greatest empires in history at the peak of its power and prestige, yet one who eludes conclusive judgment. What we can speak to with greater confidence is Titus's career before taking up the imperial purple, and using this we can come to a much more conclusive judgment on his life and career. He was a man who in many ways embodied and was deeply molded by elite imperial Roman culture. He was educated at the court of the emperor, alongside the emperor's son, and from a young age was set upon a path through the high levels of Roman politics. He was thus prone to indulgence and excess throughout his life, yet possessed a deep confidence in his own abilities and in his place in the Roman world, and stepped into roles of incredible power and responsibility, seemingly without hesitation or doubt. Due to his beneficent responses to disaster and his dedication of great public works to the people, as well as his popularity with many Roman historians and the hatred of emperors that preceded and succeeded him and his father, Titus was and is generally seen in a positive light, both by preceding Romans and by those who study Roman history to this day. The historical trend of dividing Roman emperors between those who were fundamentally good and those who were immoral and evil helps Titus's image, as he is always to be found on the side of the good emperors, alongside his father. His legacy is clouded by the excess and indulgence he displayed prior to becoming emperor, and by the somewhat thuggish nature he displayed when he was Praetorian prefect and in charge of the security of his father's regime. By far the most infamous aspect of Titus's legacy, however, and potentially the events by which he is best known, has to do with his role in the Judean campaign, and especially his command of the siege of Jerusalem. In the Roman world, this brought him great fame and acclamation, and underpinned his image and popularity for the rest of his life. The great wealth captured in the campaign and the pacification of the region were widely admired in Rome at the time, and would be remembered as one of the most famous and most effective Roman military campaigns of the 1st century AD. However, in Jewish history, Titus is remembered as a cruel tyrant, a merciless leader who brought devastation, slaughter, and destruction upon the most holy place in the Jewish world, killing many thousands of Jewish men, women, and children in the process. Jewish literature features him in numerous legends as a wicked figure who was cursed by God for his actions. To modern eyes as well, the Judean campaign appears brutal and shocking in its destruction, and Titus as a chaotic commander in the devastation he wrought on Jerusalem, or as a savage military leader with a disregard for human life. There is controversy over whether he intended to destroy the temple, but either way, this makes him a careless commander or a brutal one. Nevertheless, it must be emphasized that none of this was uncharacteristic for a Roman military commander. The destruction of such a holy place has meant that this incident has resonated especially through the ages, not least because the logic of ancient warfare, and especially Roman warfare, was well known, straightforward, and brutal. Failure to surrender a city meant almost certain destruction for that city, and defeat of a people meant death or enslavement for the vast majority. Rebellion against Rome's authority was punished by the legions in the most severe manner throughout centuries of republican and then imperial rule, and in this regard, very little about the first Jewish revolt and its destruction by Titus is out of the ordinary for the time. Another problem surrounding the revolt is the figure of 1.1 million Jewish people killed,
that is often attributed to the siege of Jerusalem and its aftermath. Historians are clear that Josephus's claim is a wild exaggeration, as it is unlikely that 1.1 million Jews were resident in the entire Judean province, let alone were killed in the city. Whilst the number was no doubt significant, historians doubt whether it was above 100,000. In addition, the fact that Josephus, who was a close supporter of Titus, would attribute over 1 million deaths to his campaign demonstrates the extent to which a Roman audience did not see these casualties at Titus's hands as a bad thing, but rather the opposite. What do you think of Titus? Was he a good moral emperor who put the people of Rome first and was a key part of one of Rome's most successful imperial dynasties? Or was he a brutal and indulgent man whose short reign obscured his faults? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
The man known to history as Emperor Domitian of Rome was born on Pomegranate Street in the 6th district of the city of Rome as Titus Flavius Domitianus on the 24th of October in the year 51 AD. His father was Titus Flavius Vespasianus, a member of the gens Flavia, a Roman equestrian family. The Flavians had mixed fortunes during the chaotic decades of civil war, which characterized the end of the Roman Republic in the 1st century BC. Under the early empire, Vespasian's father had been a provincial tax collector, hardly a prestigious position, yet one which allowed for Vespasian to carve out a career as a middling politician and then use this to rise to relatively senior military offices in the Roman legions of the 30s AD. In the mid-40s AD, he was one of the most senior military commanders involved in the initial Roman conquest of southern Britain, and served there down to the early 50s AD. Right around the time Domitian was born, Vespasian retired and played no major part in public life for over a decade thereafter. Domitian's mother was Domitilla, the daughter of a quaestor, a minor Roman official involved in financial administration. She had married Vespasian in the late 30s AD. Their first child arrived soon after, a boy named Titus, while Domitian also had a sister named Domitilla after her mother, born about 5 or 6 years before Domitian. Hence he was the youngest of the 3 siblings, and there were 12 years separating him and Titus. For an individual who would later become the most powerful man of his time, we know almost nothing about Domitian's early life. Our most detailed source is a single passage written by Suetonius, a contemporary of his who wrote biographies of the first 12 Roman emperors. This simply states that Domitian grew up in great poverty and infamy, a fairly nondescript statement, and one which was also untrue. While the Flavians were not a major Roman aristocratic family, Vespasian and his family, including Domitian, would still have lived in comfort. Indeed, in 63 AD, after over a decade in partial retirement, Domitian's father was granted the governorship of the province of Africa, corresponding to modern-day Tunisia. This would have meant that for the vast majority of the time between when he was 11 or 12 years of age, in 63 AD down to the early 70s AD, Domitian barely saw his father, nor his older brother for the most part, as Titus was already emerging as a successful commander in the Roman military. Back in Rome, we can assume that Domitian received an education typical of the son of a middling Roman politician, one which was focused on subjects such as rhetoric, the law, and literature. Domitian's younger years were spent living through a period of Roman history in which the concept of imperial rule was solidifying. The Roman Republic came to an end in 27 BC, after decades of civil wars between figures like Julius Caesar and his great rival Pompeius Magnus, or Pompey the Great. After Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC, his great-nephew Octavian became his political heir, and after defeating Mark Antony in another civil war, established a political settlement in 27 BC, through which he changed his name to Caesar Augustus and adopted the title of Imperator, meaning commander or conqueror. We derive the term emperor from this. Yet what Augustus attempted to do was to make himself the first citizen of Rome, with a large number of magisterial offices. What this meant was that he was a powerful ruler, but he continued to govern in association with the powerful Roman Senate, comprised of the state's wealthiest and most esteemed political figures. As we will see, this had significance for how Domitian's reign would play out. After Augustus's death in 14 AD, his position as Imperator was inherited by various members of his dynasty, the Julio-Claudians. The Emperor Claudius was ruling at the time of Domitian's birth, but he was succeeded in 54 AD by the Emperor Nero. Despite his later reputation, Nero was a popular ruler at first, and through much of Domitian's childhood years, there would have been no indication that civil war lay on the horizon. One of the things that contributed to the outbreak of civil war when it came was a major disturbance in the east of the empire. In 66 AD, the Jewish people in the province of Judea launched a major revolt against Roman rule, after decades of heavy-handed behavior by the Roman authorities towards their religion and denigration of the sacred temple of Jerusalem by successive Roman governors of the province. This exploded into insurrection in 66 AD. The first Jewish revolt would last for well over half a decade. When it initially broke out, the Roman commanders in the eastern provinces around Syria and the Levant proved incapable of suppressing it, and so Nero soon appointed Domitian's father, Vespasian, to oversee the military campaign. Vespasian left along with Domitian's older brother, Titus, to wage war in Judea. Domitian was left behind in Rome as he was still reasonably young, though a young adult in Roman terms by then. His whereabouts and activities during this period, around 67 and 68 AD, are frustratingly unclear. Vespasian's first wife, Domitian's mother, died around this time, and it is probable that Domitian was living in the household of his uncle, Vespasian's brother, Titus Flavius Sabinus, in Italy, while Vespasian and Titus were engaged against the first Jewish revolt in the east. Although nearly all of the correspondence which the Romans engaged in with each other, the millions and millions of letters which passed over and back across the Mediterranean world over a period of centuries, have nearly all been lost, we can speculate that Domitian might have written to his father in Judea in the summer of 68 AD to alert him to momentous political events in Rome. The Emperor Nero had become increasingly unpopular in previous years as a result of the Great Fire of Rome, which destroyed much of the city in 64 AD, and a number of other developments, not least the outbreak of the Jewish revolt in the east. Early in 68 AD, the governors of provinces in Gaul and Hispania had rebelled against the emperor, and the crisis soon spread to Rome itself, where Nero lost all support, fled the capital and took his own life. He was succeeded by Galba, the governor of the Spanish province, who had been a major contributor to the war and who now seized power, bringing the Julio-Claudian dynasty to an end. Yet this was just the beginning of a sustained period of civil war. Galba was in turn murdered in January 69 AD by Otto, who in turn only ruled for 13 weeks before Aulus Vitellius, the commander of the Roman legions on the Rhine frontier in Germania, came south towards Italy and seized power as Emperor Vitellius in April 69 AD. Speculating on the extent to which Domitian was keeping his father abreast of affairs in Rome is important, because this information would have dictated much of Vespasian's response to these events. Vespasian's response in the east would come to dictate the course of the rest of Domitian's life. In Judea, his father was in charge of several legions of troops, each consisting of nearly 5,000 soldiers. He had been provided with an unusually large military force in order to crush the Jewish revolt. What this meant was that as events unfolded to the west in Rome and Western Europe, Vespasian had the military resources necessary to potentially claim the imperial title himself. He duly did so. After the governors of several provinces in the east indicated they would support him, Vespasian was proclaimed as emperor and commenced a civil war with Vitellius. In Rome, Domitian was immediately placed under house arrest when news of his father's treachery reached Vitellius's government. He was still detained in this way when legions loyal to Vespasian arrived at Italy from the borders along the river Danube and began clashing with Vitellius's forces in the late autumn and early winter of 69 AD. Vitellius's forces were defeated in northern Italy, but the final stages of the civil war saw violent clashes in and around the city of Rome itself on the 19th and 20th of December, during which Domitian's uncle, Sabinus, was killed. Domitian, by all accounts, nearly lost his life as well, escaping a mob of Vitellius's supporters by apparently disguising himself as a priest of the Egyptian deity Isis. Thereafter, Vespasian's forces entered Rome and murdered Vitellius. Domitian's father was accepted as the new emperor by the Senate shortly thereafter. The civil war was over. When the supporters of Vespasian emerged victorious in Rome in late December 69 AD, Domitian's father was still far away in the east. The military campaign into Italy had actually been overseen by his close ally, Licinius Mucianus. As the son of the new emperor, Domitian was quickly proclaimed as Caesar, an honorary title meaning something equivalent in more modern terms to prince. This honor aside, it was Mucianus who ran affairs in Rome until such time as Vespasian arrived after a considerable delay. In 71 AD, Domitian took part in the military triumph, which was held in Rome in honor of Vespasian's victory in the civil war, and Titus's capture of the city of Jerusalem from the Jewish rebels in 70 AD. These military triumphs were a common feature of Roman life well into the Republican period, and consisted of a major parade and festival organized in the city to honor the conquering generals. Even at this early date, Domitian was clearly being placed in the line of succession to potentially succeed as emperor one day if Titus predeceased their father or died himself without an heir. Hostile accounts of Domitian, written by Roman historians, imply that Vespasian had detected some sort of character defects in his younger son and was attempting to exclude him from the succession. However, there is no evidence to suggest that this was the case. Domitian's career during the decade that his father was emperor actually points towards Vespasian favoring his younger son, as well as his brother Titus. Domitian, for instance, was appointed by his father as one of the consuls of Rome, the most important political office in the state, beyond that of emperor, on no less than 6 occasions, as well as being the senior consul in 73 AD. One Roman historian suggests that Domitian petitioned to be given the command of a Roman army if one were sent east to aid the king of the Parthian Empire, Vologases I, when he requested the help of Rome against the invasion of Parthia by a nomad confederacy of the Alans, a people who dominated the Pontic-Caspian steppe at that time. This was during a rare period of amicable relations between Rome and Parthia, who were normally mortal enemies in the ancient Middle East. The Alans would later come to haunt the Romans, migrating west in the 4th century and invading Germania and Gaul. Domitian's desire to have been appointed to the command, had it materialized, may have reflected his hopes of achieving some military renown in emulation of his older brother Titus, who had been so instrumental in the suppression of the Jewish revolt. Beyond this, the 70s AD were also significant in Domitian's life for his marriage to Domitia Longina in 71 AD, the daughter of a renowned Roman general, Gnaeus Domitius Corbulo, who had been forced to end his own life by Nero in 67 AD, after the emperor became fearful of his popularity amongst the Roman people. Domitian and Domitia's marriage was largely childless. At least one child was born to them, but died in infancy, leading to the adoption of other children, a not uncommon occurrence in Roman society, where adoption was extremely common amongst the upper classes. Domitian's father died in the summer of 79 AD, just short of his 70th year. Titus succeeded him as a new hereditary dynasty, the Flavians, was firmly established. He was an enormously popular ruler by all accounts, owing to his military prowess in his earlier years and well-liked policies which he pursued during his brief time in power, notably a series of lavish festivities held in Rome to celebrate the opening of the Flavian amphitheatre, which Vespasian had begun the construction of years earlier and which is better known today as the Colosseum. No sooner had these games been held than Titus promptly died just 2 years into his reign at 41 years of age in September 81 AD. The symptoms of his death involved a fever of some sort, but it is unclear what actually killed him. It was all suspicious enough that biographers of Domitian after his own time suggested that he plotted to kill his brother, with one stating that when Titus became ill, Domitian, quote, ordered that he be left for dead. There is no evidence to prove this, but it did benefit him all the same. Titus had no children, and so Domitian became emperor of Rome at 29 years of age. His first order was to deify his brother, a common practice which stated that a Roman emperor had become a god in death. At the outset of considering Domitian's reign, it is worth examining how political power was shared in the Roman Empire, as well as the main sources which we have available for Domitian's life, and how those sources were biased by rivalry between the emperor and his staff and the Senate in the 1st century AD. While Caesar Augustus had claimed immense power back in 27 BC, he didn't become an absolute ruler in the sense of a modern dictator or an early modern absolutist monarch. Instead, he took the powers which several magistrates, such as the Roman tribunes, had held during the Republican periods into his hands. This gave him huge authority, but there were still some limitations on the emperor's behavior. Furthermore, the management of the Roman provinces was divided up, with roughly half of the empire's provinces being managed by the emperor and the imperial staff, known as the Familia Caesaris, or family of Caesar, and the other half managed by the Senate. What this indicates is that while the Roman emperors were enormously powerful, they were still expected to respect the Senate and the leading aristocratic families who provided the several hundred senators. Domitian, it seems clear from the available evidence, clashed with the Senate as his reign went on. This is highly significant in terms of how his time as emperor has been interpreted, as 2 of the 3 major sources for his reign were written by senators, and the third was also sympathetic to the Senate. These are the Lives of the Caesars by Suetonius, who was not a senator but generally presented a less than flattering picture of any emperor who was known to have clashed with the Senate. The writings of Tacitus, a senator and major political figure himself during Domitian's reign, and Cassius Dio, a Greco-Roman senator who was writing at a lengthy remove from events in the early 3rd century and who echoed the criticisms of Suetonius and Tacitus. All 3 presented a negative picture of Domitian, and this has colored views of the emperor down to the present day. However, it doesn't mean their view of him was wholly correct. Ancient Greek and Roman historians often did not try to write in an objective, neutral fashion, but instead sought to convince their readers of a particular political viewpoint, sometimes even presenting fabricated details if they suited their arguments. Hence, any appraisal of Domitian's reign should take into account this immense bias, which is inherent in the main sources for his life and reign. On occasion, the hostility towards him was somewhat inexplicable. Another writer, Pliny the Younger, also critiqued Domitian after he was dead, despite the fact that Domitian had facilitated Pliny's progression through the cursus honorum, the succession of offices which any aspiring political figure expected to ascend through in order to become governor of a province and senior member of the Senate. We have a clear example of how this tension between the emperor and the Senate and the traditional Roman aristocracy played out, in one instance that also relates to a major aspect of foreign policy during Domitian's reign. This comes from Britain. The Romans had been in contact with Britain since Julius Caesar's time, though it was not until the reign of Emperor Claudius in the 40s AD that the first conquest of the island was undertaken, with much of what is now southern England being brought under Roman rule during the reigns of Claudius and Nero. Domitian's father and brother had continued the policy of expansion there, and in the 70s AD, Roman legions campaigned north into northern England and westwards into Wales. In 77 AD, Vespasian entrusted this work into the hands of Gnaeus Julius Agricola, a member of an esteemed Roman senatorial family and an experienced military commander. He was made proconsul or governor of Britain by Domitian's father. Agricola was immediately successful, conquering the Ordovices tribe of Celts in Wales and on the island of Anglesey in his first years in command in Britain. Domitian left Agricola in charge in Britain upon his accession. The governor continued to do good work from a Roman perspective. In 83 and 84 AD, he campaigned as far north as any Roman army ever did, progressing through the Scottish lowlands and then heading further north into the highlands, clashing with the Celtic Caledonians there, and possibly even sailing by and landing on the Orkney Islands in 84 AD. This was as close as the Romans would ever come to subjugating the Caledonians, a people who had proved particularly resistant to Roman rule, requiring the Emperor Hadrian to build his famous wall across northern England a half a century later to keep them out of the Roman province. Given his successes, it is peculiar then that Agricola was recalled from Britain by Domitian in 85 AD. In addition, he was not given a major military command thereafter, and the suspicion has lingered that Domitian was jealous of Agricola's military successes and ended his career as a result. At the same time, it is hard to be sure. Our major source for these events is a biographical history of Agricola's life and career, which was written by Tacitus, who also happened to be Agricola's son-in-law. On the one hand, Tacitus presented Domitian's treatment of his father-in-law as a clear example of the emperor's disrespectful attitude towards the traditional Roman aristocracy, yet on the other hand, Agricola had served nearly 8 years as governor of Britain when he was recalled in 85 AD, an unusually long period to serve as governor of a province. In contrast to Agricola, Domitian's own military exploits in the early years of his reign were relatively modest. He was primarily focused on campaigning against the Chatti, a tribe which controlled a large extent of territory beyond the Roman frontier in what is now the Lower Saxony region of Germany. Germanic tribes like the Chatti were a constant source of agitation for the Romans, as they perennially tried to make raids over the Roman borders to strike at rich settlements inside the empire. Often such attacks were undertaken at times of perceived weakness within the empire. In this particular instance, Domitian seems to have instigated the campaign rather than it being a response to any hostility by the Chatti. His motive in doing so was probably a desire to establish his credentials as an emperor who could conduct military campaigns. There is more than a hint of some insecurity here on Domitian's part about the fact that his father and brother had both been esteemed generals before they ever became emperor, whereas Domitian had no credentials in this regard. If the campaign against the Chatti was designed to establish a military reputation, it clearly didn't work. Contemporaries derided the brief war against the tribe as unnecessary. It largely consisted of a simple raid into Chatti territory and the construction of a Roman road, with Domitian then declaring victory and ordering a triumph to be held in his honor at Rome. He also took the celebratory title of Germanicus, a common title adopted by members of the imperial family who had campaigned in Germania. While his campaign against the Chatti was something of a stunt, Domitian was responsible for strengthening the northern borders in the course of his reign in other ways. 7 decades before Domitian ever became emperor, the first Roman emperor, Caesar Augustus, as he neared the end of his life, had laid out advice for his successors. A key recommendation had been that the empire should not be expanded any further and that the borders should be consolidated. This advice had been followed fairly closely, particularly so in Germania and further east into Central Europe and the Balkans, where the River Rhine and the River Danube were fixed as natural defensive points on the northern frontier. Over the decades, a series of fortifications and extensive border defenses were erected along this vast border. Known as the Limes Germanicus, limes meaning frontier, Domitian added to these defenses, ordering the erection of a large fort at Saalburg on the main ridge of Mount Taunus, as an advanced frontier defense some 25 kilometers northeast of the River Rhine and near modern-day Frankfurt. He also oversaw the erection of new fortifications along the Rhetian limes. This was the weakest point of the entire northern frontier, a 550-kilometer-long section of the border running between the River Rhine and the River Danube in southern Germany, which did not have the advantage of a natural river border. These building works were not confined to military fortifications along the long northern frontier. Like every emperor since Caesar Augustus, a ruler who famously remarked that he found Rome a city of brick and made it one of marble, Domitian oversaw a major building program in the Eternal City. Some of this focused on the amphitheaters and racing tracks there, while the construction and initial completion of the Colosseum, known in ancient times as the Flavian Amphitheater, was undertaken by Vespasian and Titus. Domitian did add to the work of his father and brother. A gallery was built on the top tier of the stadium to increase its capacity to a maximum of about 80,000 people, meaning that at the height of Domitian's reign, approximately 1 in every 12 or 13 denizens of the city of Rome could attend the events here. Domitian also was responsible for the construction of the Hypogeum, a system of subterranean tunnels and rooms in which gladiators prepared for the fights above and wild animals were kept. Hinged platforms allowed for animals and gladiators to be lifted directly up from the Hypogeum to the main amphitheater, much like an ancient elevator. In 86 AD, Domitian also presided over the opening of the Stadium of Domitian, a venue for athletic contests which was constructed primarily during his reign, though Titus had commissioned it in 80 AD as part of the reconstruction of the Field of Mars region of the city after a major fire leveled many buildings there the previous year. The stadium was infamous in medieval times as the site where St. Agnes, one of the earliest Christian saints, was allegedly martyred during Domitian's reign. Like much of the history of the early Christian martyrs, the basis for this is generally based on questionable evidence written by Christian hagiographers centuries later. Domitian's building work extended beyond stadiums and centers for the holding of games and gladiatorial contests. Much of it was concerned with religion. Domitian's religious policy was very traditional, and he honored the old Roman gods through an extensive temple-building program. The central pillar of this was the rebuilding of the Temple of Jupiter Optimus on the Capitoline Hill in central Rome. This was one of the most important temples in the entire Roman world. Unfortunately, it was destroyed twice in quick succession during the rule of the Flavians. Once in December 69 AD, during the battle for control of Rome at the very end of the Civil War, which brought Vespasian to power, and again a decade later in a fire in the city, after Vespasian had rebuilt it just a few years earlier. Hence, Domitian's orders to rebuild it constituted the second time that the temple was reconstructed in less than a decade. Domitian's version of the temple was apparently the most lavish yet built, with a thin layer of gold across the entire rooftop, something which must have been quite a spectacle in ancient Rome on a sunny day, and was also doubtlessly a magnet for thieves. Elsewhere, in a somewhat peculiar obsession with a faraway province, Domitian expended a large amount of imperial revenue having temples rebuilt or expanded in Egypt, notably the Dendera temple complex in southern Egypt, where the Temple of Hathor, dedicated to an Egyptian sun deity, was built on Domitian's orders. Beyond these religious structures, Domitian was also responsible for erecting a number of buildings which catered more towards his and the imperial household's needs and the legacy of the Flavian dynasty. For instance, while it bears the name of his brother and was erected in his honor, it was Domitian who had the Arch of Titus built on the Via Sacra in Rome. This was built to commemorate Titus's role in the suppression of the first Jewish revolt, as well as their fathers. The Arch of Titus has survived in a remarkable state of preservation and has been the inspiration for a number of triumphal arches built in more modern times, notably the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, commissioned in the early 19th century by Napoleon Bonaparte. The Arch of Titus was most likely designed by the architect Rabirius, who was also responsible for the design of the Villa of Domitian, or Alban Palace, a vast palace laid out for Domitian in the Alban Hills, not far from Rome, and overlooking the city's main port of Ostia. After its completion, Domitian spent a growing amount of time here. This may have contributed to the growing divide between him and the Senate. Another of his predecessors, Tiberius, became increasingly unpopular in the second half of his reign after he effectively abandoned Rome to go and live in his palace on the island of Capri, and it appears that the senatorial class were disillusioned by the idea that an emperor would rule in a heavy-handed fashion from a distant palace rather than from within Rome itself, where he would consult with the Senate regularly. Domitian might have spent lavishly on erecting these buildings in Rome, its environs, and in Egypt, yet he was not a spendthrift ruler. He was concerned with managing the public finances in a prudent manner, particularly after a fiscal crisis of sorts in the mid-80s AD. One of the few fields of endeavor which the ancient Greeks and Romans did not have a very sophisticated approach to was economics. There was only limited understanding of how issues like inflation and fiscal crises arose. In response to them, Domitian ordered reform of the Roman coinage. The silver sesterces, the standard form of Roman coin, one which was made of actual solid silver, had been devalued during the crisis period of the late 60s and early 70s AD, as the first Jewish revolt and the civil wars created a need for more and more coins to pay the legions and to offer financial bribes to both soldiers and politicians who agreed to support a contender for the imperial title in return for money. The upshot of this was that silver coins started being produced that had cheap base metals mixed into them to reduce the amount of silver needed to mint them. By the 70s AD, the silver content in some of the coins had fallen to below 90%, and people were becoming aware of this coinage manipulation. Domitian was the first of the Flavians who moved to reverse this, and studies of coins from Domitian's reign from 85 AD onwards indicate that the silver content returned consistently to over 95% at that time, restoring confidence in the coinage. This was an enlightened approach, given that the drastic devaluation of the coinage in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD caused immense havoc in time to come, contributing in a major way to the collapse of the Roman Empire. One notable element of Domitian's fiscal policy was his decision to continue and even expand what was known as the Fiscus Judaicus, the Jewish tax. This was a tax which had been first imposed by his father, Vespasian, on the Jews of the province of Judea, essentially as a punishment for having revolted against Roman rule and the cost of suppressing the first Jewish revolt. It was initially imposed on adult male Jews and those who actively practiced Judaism. Domitian, though, expanded the tax so that it was applied to all Jews, be they men, women, or children of any age, as well as Jews outside of Judea itself, notably in Egypt, where there was a large Jewish community in cities like Alexandria. Even non-practicing Jews seem to have been forced to pay the tax. Domitian's zeal in imposing the tax may have reflected his own insecurities about not having been involved in suppressing the Jewish revolt back in the late 60s and early 70s AD, along with his father and brother. The degree to which it was imposed may also have reflected official anxieties about the seeming spread of Judaism to new communities in the Eastern Mediterranean. What the Roman authorities may have actually been noticing in this respect wasn't the spread of Judaism, but actually the emergence of some of the first communities of Christians in parts of the Levant, Egypt, Asia Minor, and Greece, a religion which for many decades the Romans perceived as simply being a branch of Judaism. An enormous proportion of all the tax take of the Roman state was spent on the military. In a state which was very light on welfare and government intervention in spheres other than the financing of its war machine, over 50% of the state budget was spent on supporting the legions in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. This is all the more remarkable when we consider that for extended periods of time there was little warfare being engaged in. As we have seen, there was a regional conflict in Britain, where successive emperors over a period of centuries were trying to extend the border further north, and there were perennial clashes with tribes like the Chatti near the Rhine River frontier. Beyond these, though, Domitian only engaged in major conflicts in one area during his decade-and-a-half-long rule. This was against the Dacian kingdom, a powerful state ruled by the Dacians, an Asiatic people who had migrated into the Balkans over half a millennium earlier. By Domitian's time, they ruled territories centered on modern-day Romania and extended into parts of Serbia, Bulgaria, and other regions. In 85 AD, their king, Duras, ordered his armies to conduct a raid over the border into the Roman province of Mysia. This action led to war between Rome and Dacia, which would last down to 88 AD. The Dacian War started terribly for Domitian. The initial incursion by the Dacians led to the destruction of a Roman legion under the command of the governor of Mysia, Gaius Oppius Sabinus. The loss of a legion and its standards, the banners which bore the symbols of Rome and the identity of the legion, was considered a serious stain on the honor of the Roman state, and when news reached Rome of the incident, Domitian decided to campaign in person against the Dacians. Legions were quickly ordered to move from other fronts to the Danube frontier. The emperor was there in the Serbia region for much of 86 AD and divided Mysia into two provinces, Mysia Inferior and Mysia Superior, in order to allow for better administration and more effective dealing with the Dacian threat. After these initial efforts to prepare for the campaign, Domitian, somewhat surprisingly, left Mysia and handed over command of the campaign to Cornelius Fuscus, the prefect of the Praetorian Guard. Fuscus won some minor victories initially. Thereafter, the new Dacian king, Decebalus, won a major victory over Fuscus leading to Fuscus's replacement by Tetius Julianus. Julianus did what Sabinus and Fuscus were unable to do, and gained the initiative in the war. By 88 AD, he was preparing to strike against the Dacian capital, Sarmizegetusa. However, just as this was in preparation, two other tribes, the Marcomanni and the Quadi, began to threaten the Roman border further to the west, around the weak point of the Rhaetian limes. With this, Domitian agreed to peace with the Dacians, so that some of the legions under Julianus's command could be transferred west to shore up the border area between the Danube and the Rhine rivers. The Dacian War, however, presaged a period of growing conflict between Rome and Dacia, and 20 years later, the Emperor Trajan would annex Dacia in one of the last major conquests undertaken by the Romans. Domitian's reign was a notable one in terms of Roman culture. The last decades of the 1st century AD witnessed two broad literary trends. The first was the emergence of some of the foremost Roman and Greco-Roman historians, whose writings have come down to us, particularly historical biographers. Domitian can hardly be credited with playing a role in this, for two of the main individuals involved, Suetonius and Tacitus, were, as we have seen, hostile towards him, while another, the Greco-Roman historical biographer, Plutarch, lived and worked far from Rome in Greece as a priest at the temple of Apollo at Delphi, and did not benefit from the patronage of Domitian, although he had obtained some favor from Vespasian when on a visit to Rome in the 70s AD. Domitian was involved, though, in the other great literary movement of the era. This was a period which saw the genre of satire and satirical poetry reach its peak at Rome, with the satirical writers Juvenal and Martial both producing much of their greatest work during the 80s and 90s AD. The emperor was clearly a patron, especially so of Martial, who recorded being invited to dine with Domitian on one occasion. In return, the poet lauded the emperor, focusing in his second book of epigrams on Domitian's military campaign in Germania, stating, "The laurel given for the chatty is totally yours," in recognition of Domitian's military victory over that tribe early in his reign. Juvenal's relationship with Domitian was more complicated. He obtained imperial patronage early in his career, but his satire became a bit too biting over the years. He is famously associated with the quip that the Roman people were won over by the superficial distractions of bread and circuses. However, his most penetrating attack on the Roman elite came in his fourth satire, in which he uses the metaphor of a fish to describe the waste and wanton luxury of Roman high society. Juvenal was eventually exiled from Rome, though it is unclear if Domitian was responsible for his expulsion from the city or the Emperor Trajan. Certainly, Juvenal critiqued Domitian directly in some of his work. Nevertheless, his more overt attacks on the emperor were written many years after Domitian had died, when Juvenal was pandering in the 120s AD to new aristocratic patrons at a time when it had become fashionable to denigrate the deceased emperor. Overall, there is no major evidence to suggest that Domitian was any more inclined to censor writers in Rome than any of his predecessors, and the imperial government continued to patronize scholars who were not independently wealthy and who relied on aristocratic patronage for their living. This favor even extended to the Romano-Jewish scholar Josephus. Josephus was a former Jewish rebel commander who had been involved against Rome at the very start of the First Jewish Revolt. He was captured early on by the Romans and subsequently became a trusted advisor to Titus as he suppressed the rebellion. Later, he left for Rome with his patron, and there he composed one of the most important works written on Jewish history and Judaism in ancient times, under the patronage of Vespasian and Titus. His Jewish War, finished towards the end of Vespasian's reign, for instance, provides not just a forensic survey of the First Jewish Revolt, but one of the most detailed accounts of any war fought in antiquity. It was formerly believed, in line with the general tendency to view Domitian negatively, that the patronage which Josephus acquired from the imperial family ended with Titus's death in 81 AD. However, this is an entirely spurious characterization. Josephus stated in an autobiographical account of his own life that the patronage he received from the emperors remained the same through the reigns of Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian, and several of his more important works, the Antiquities of the Jews and Against Apion, were written during Domitian's reign under imperial patronage and published in 93 and 94 AD. While he may have been tolerant of the satirical barbs offered by Martial and Juvenal for the most part and a patron of Josephus, Domitian was decidedly less patient when it came to certain schools of philosophy. In 93 AD, he issued a decree which expelled the philosophers from Rome and the entirety of the Italian peninsula. These appear to have been proponents of the Stoic school of philosophy, one of several major schools which include Platonism, Cynicism, and Epicureanism. Prior to this, Domitian had ordered the execution of several prominent Stoics. His expulsion order ensured that one prominent Stoic philosopher, Epictetus, left Rome and set up his own philosophy academy across the Adriatic Sea in northwestern Greece, at Nicopolis. It used to be considered that Domitian was something of an outlier in deciding on such a course. However, further studies have indicated that several emperors of the 1st century, including Domitian's father Vespasian, issued decrees against the Stoics, who appear to have formed some sort of social opposition to rulers who were deemed to be too autocratic in the 1st century AD. What's peculiar about this is that the Stoics went from being figures of persecution in the 1st century to hold power themselves a century later. Marcus Aurelius, who ruled as emperor between 161 and 180 AD, was a noted Stoic philosopher himself. It is almost impossible to determine what Domitian was like on a personal level. This is because the best account that we have in this respect comes from Suetonius. Suetonius was a most unusual historian, one whose Lives of the Caesars is an immensely valuable source for the history of the early Roman Empire, yet whose tendency towards depicting the emperors almost like pantomime figures when it came to their personalities can make it difficult to separate fact from fiction. In particular, he had a tendency to exaggerate the supposed vices of the emperors. For instance, of Domitian, Suetonius tells us that, quote, "He was excessively lustful. His constant sexual intercourse he called bed wrestling, as if it were a kind of exercise," before informing us that Domitian, quote, "swam with common prostitutes." Elsewhere, he tells us that when he first succeeded Titus as emperor, Domitian would spend hours at a time locked away in his rooms, idling the time away, doing nothing except killing flies, while officials and imperial officers waited outside trying to get him to govern the empire. These passages aside, there is enough information provided by Suetonius to be able to begin to form some kind of accurate picture of who Domitian actually was. He was evidently taller than average, with a tanned complexion and large eyes, though evidently with poor sight. He was an educated ruler, one who was responsible for rebuilding and restocking many of the libraries across Rome, which had been destroyed during the Great Fire which consumed much of the city back in 64 AD during Nero's reign. This was clearly something of a passion of his, and Suetonius tells us that he expended a great amount of imperial finances on rebuilding the libraries as well as trying to reacquire as many works as possible, even dispatching many scribes to the great library at Alexandria in Egypt to produce copies of books there and bring them back to Rome. Beyond this, his other great interest seems to have been, like many other Romans, the games held in the amphitheatre and the racing tracks of the city, paying for gladiatorial contests and chariot races to be held frequently. He enjoyed gambling on these and on dice, though in other aspects of his life he was moderate in his habits, holding banquets on occasion, though usually retiring early and rarely drinking or eating to excess. Even emperors can be extremely self-conscious. Domitian, by all accounts, was a relatively handsome man in his younger years, but as he grew older, he gained weight and started to go bald. On one occasion, he stated of a senior political figure, "How I wish that I were as fine-looking as Machias thinks he is." His receding hairline troubled him greatly, and he took offense whenever he heard of anyone being insulted for their baldness, as though it was a slur against his own lack of hair. Such was his obsession with his hairline that he even composed a book on the subject, entitled On the Care of the Hair. Incredibly, this appears to have not been a made-up story of Suetonius's, as he even quotes from the text, and presumably his readers would have been familiar with the work in question. The book was addressed to a friend of Domitian's, who also suffered from hair loss, and who the emperor bemoaned the fate of his hair to in the following words: "Do you not see that I am too tall and comely to look on? And yet the same fate awaits my hair, and I bear with resignation the aging of my locks in youth. Be assured that nothing is more pleasing than beauty, but nothing shorter lived." Domitian had greater problems than just his hair loss. While the exact reasons for it can be debated, there is no doubt that by the late 80s AD, there was growing opposition to his rule from many quarters. The first major sign of this came in 89 AD, when Lucius Antonius Saturninus, the governor of the province of Germania Superior, revolted against the emperor. This was a serious matter. The provinces in Germania, along the border at the river Rhine, were highly militarized, and any revolt from this part of the empire always ensured that the leader of any such insurrection there had a large number of troops under his command. In Saturninus's case, the revolt was quickly suppressed. He had initiated it on the 1st of January, in the middle of winter, having secured an alliance with the Chatti, the tribe Domitian had waged war on early in his reign. However, their plan to join Saturninus's legion after he raised the revolt against Domitian was foiled when a sudden bout of warmer weather melted the ice on the river Rhine and prevented the Chatti from joining up with Saturninus's troops. As a result, in a matter of less than 4 weeks, Roman legions from the surrounding provinces moved into Germania Superior on Domitian's orders and crushed the rebellion. Nevertheless, it pointed towards a growing discontent within Domitian's rule. Saturninus might well have revolted in the expectation that if he secured control of several provinces along the northern border, the Senate and its followers in Rome might abandon Domitian in the same way that Nero had lost their support in 68 AD, leading to his fall from power. There certainly appears to have been a growing animosity between the emperor and a faction within the Senate. This was in part responsible for the expulsion of the Stoic philosophers from Rome and Italy in the early 90s AD, as Domitian identified them as being associated with his opponents. Several senators were found guilty of crimes over these years and were executed. This is presented as evidence by Tacitus and Suetonius of Domitian's growing tyranny as his reign progressed. It wasn't out of the ordinary, though. Emperors such as Claudius back in the 40s and early 50s AD had regularly seen the need to execute senators who were perceived as plotting against the regime, and yet they were judged much more favorably by the same historians. Domitian's condemnation was rooted in a much more broad animosity among the senatorial class, which was tied into ideas about the traditional honor which should be afforded to the Roman nobility. Given the accounts provided, it also seems reasonable to suggest that Domitian's behavior did in fact become more incendiary in the mid-90s AD, while also acknowledging that the extent of this was exaggerated by his critics. Matters came to a head in 96 AD. In a strange development, given the growing standoff between the emperor and the Senate, the conspiracy which saw him assassinated emerged from within Domitian's household staff. The ringleaders were a steward called Stephanus and a chamberlain called Parthenius. On the 18th of September, they organized for the doors of Domitian's private apartments to be locked and then approached him, apparently on official business. Stephanus presented the emperor with a scroll, and while Domitian was preparing to read it, he then drew a concealed dagger and stabbed the emperor in the groin. A scuffle followed in which Domitian tried to have an attendant retrieve a nearby dagger for him, but as he did so, other servants rushed forward and stabbed the emperor repeatedly. In a classic example of the flowery stories which Roman historians injected in their work, both Suetonius and Cassius Dio relate that a soothsayer of Germanic origin, Larginus Proclus, had predicted the emperor's imminent death just days earlier through interpretation of lightning. We are probably on steadier ground in assuming that the conspiracy involved more than those who actually stabbed Domitian to death, as within a very short period of time, Titus Petronius Secundus, one of the commanders of the Praetorian Guard, was securing the imperial precinct, and leading senators were being informed of the assassination. Who amongst these might have been involved in the plot remains a mystery. In the immediate aftermath of Domitian's assassination, while the former emperor's blood was still settling, the Senate convened and they elected one of their own, Marcus Cocceius Nerva, as the new emperor. Nerva was a well-respected senator, though an elderly one in his mid-60s. His selection was a consensus choice, with the expectation that his reign would be a short one, and a more lasting solution could be found in the interim. And so it proved to be. He died just 16 months later, and thereafter Marcus Ulpius Trajanus, who Nerva had appointed as his heir, succeeded him. Trajan's accession marked a new departure in the Roman Empire, whereby the previous emperor would select a worthy individual who was not necessarily a close blood relative. He would then adopt this heir who would succeed him upon his death. The system proved effective. Trajan was widely considered to have been amongst the greatest of the Roman emperors, with some memorials praising him even above Caesar Augustus. His successors also ruled well, and so the period from Domitian's assassination down to the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 AD, encompassing the reigns of Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, is typically referred to today as the period of the 5 good emperors, an age which the great Enlightenment historian Edward Gibbon deemed to be the era in which life was best for any people in any society in history. Domitian has traditionally been viewed as one of the more tyrannical of the Roman emperors. This is entirely in keeping with the view of him presented by Suetonius and Tacitus, in line with their senatorial bias. However, this interpretation of him needs to be taken with a very large pinch of salt. While there is no doubt that he clashed with the Senate and this proved to be his undoing, this does not necessarily mean that he was a poor ruler. If anything, it simply points to the power which the Senate held over a half a century after the creation of the empire. In other respects, his reign was successful. His building program was considerable, and in many ways he ushered in the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, which is more usually associated with the 5 good emperors. Furthermore, in many ways Domitian made strides to combat the issues which would be Rome's undoing. Beginning in the 3rd century AD, the empire entered a period of crisis based on the overt power of the military, which caused civil war after civil war, as well as the invasions of Germanic and Asiatic tribes across the Rhine and Danube into the empire, along with a fiscal crisis caused by the drastic lowering of the silver content in the Roman coinage. A century and a half before this crisis began, Domitian was taking steps to combat 2 of these 3 issues by reforming the coinage and increasing the silver content, and by establishing extensive fortifications along the northern border. In these respects, whatever the bias of his ancient biographers might have been, Domitian was in many ways a competent ruler. What do you think of the Emperor Domitian? Did he become a tyrant as his reign went on, or was he unfairly maligned by the senatorial class? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.